thanks. I'll just have a quick word of welcome. The purpose, obviously, of today's event is really to give us all an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper in some of the most interesting issues that are going on in this already oh-so-interesting campaign season. So there will be ample time for questions and answers for our panelists. The panels are really balanced. I hope that it will serve to give everybody both an overview of a lot of the policy recommendations that are coming out of the three campaigns right now, and then also varying perspectives on how they take on the issues of climate change, healthcare, and tax policy. So I'm going to quickly turn it over to our fearless moderator, David Wessel. And I will just say that running the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and the Fiscal Policy Program at the New America Foundation, I have a chance to host numerous events. Never before have I hosted an event in a tent, and I hope that they will kind of roll out a wedding cake at the end of it. So enjoy the discussion today. I look forward to all of your questions. There's breakfast in the back, and thanks so much for joining us. David.
So I think everybody's going to get one tent joke. No more and no less. Mine is, it's a little chilly in here, but we aim to fill the room with enough hot air to make it warm. Why don't I have the panelists come up here? We're going to start this morning with a discussion of climate change. And we're going to lead off with Bill Pizer from Resources for the Future. I'm not going to read everybody's bios. They're on the program. If you have any questions about their bios, feel free to ask them. Bill is going to give a quick synopsis, 5-7 minutes, of where the candidates are on climate change. And then Nikki Roy from the Pew Center on Global Climate Change and my friend Bob McNally from Tudor Investment are going to respond for about 5 minutes each. If I can keep them to the quota, which is why you have obnoxious reporters moderate panels like this, we should have time for good questions before we turn to the easy problem of the day, healthcare. When I looked at the program here, I sort of thought, you do climate change and healthcare because they're the hard ones. That'll make the tax and budget deficit stuff seem easier. So, do you want to start? Oh, you want to start. Right here. Yes.
I guess my tent joke will be that I'm getting married in a month, and if anybody's not using this tent after this event is over, my car's out back. Let me start by saying, first of all, that what I'm sharing today are just personal views. For those of you who know Resources for the Future, it's a nonpartisan, non-advocacy research organization. We try to educate people about energy, environment, natural resource issues. I invite you to visit our website. But this is just kind of my own inklings on these things after having spent a few years working on this issue. I guess my main point in the 5 to 7 minutes I have is that the three candidates have remarkably similar positions on this issue. If you look at the numbers, you would say, well, McCain is looking for a 60% reduction by 2050, and Obama and Clinton are arguing for 80%. And I've kind of been waiting for the day when a candidate comes out and wants 110% below 1990, but at least they haven't gone that far. So I think the main issue actually, this is I guess my second point, I think the main issue for people who are interested in this issue is to ask themselves the question, who is going to be the most effective at passing legislation quickly? Because this is an issue that's been sitting around for a long time. Most people think the time is ripe. But it's a hard question, as David suggested, and I think the real issue here is who's going to be able to bring the thing through Congress. And what I want to do is just mention what I see as the 4 tough questions that any candidate is going to face in trying to pass some sort of mandatory legislation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm assuming right now that they would be through some sort of a cap and trade proposal. But one could imagine that a different type of like a tax proposal might have some legs at some point. So let me just run through those 4 things, then come back to this point of who could perhaps pass it easily, best. The first issue is cost management. One of the key issues that's kind of come to the forefront over the past few months is how a proposal is going to deal with uncertainty about how much the program is going to cost. Everybody's very concerned about the environment, and that's where you get these reductions of 80% or 60% or whatever the number is. But lurking in the background in the debate is how much is this going to hurt the economy, how much is this going to hurt jobs. A lot of people want to package this as making money for the economy. I tend to be, as an economist, a little skeptical they're going to make money, but I think it's a serious problem and deserves to have some resources spent on it. But figuring out how to balance that energy, that environment and economy, that balance is going to be tricky. And there have been a lot of proposals that have come up in the debate so far in the Senate. And they involve things like safety valves or reserves, or having some executive board that could manage these things if Congress can't deal with the balance. But trying to figure out some way to balance the environmental goal with the cost of the economy, not just immediately but over time, I think is one of the 4 key questions. The second key question that goes with this is competitiveness. And the concern there is that if we're going to be taking on some sort of mandatory controls on our economy, and for our emissions, what happens when trading partners like China do not? And this becomes not just an economic issue of jobs and output going to China, it becomes an environmental issue because the emissions might go to China as well. And there are, again, a lot of proposals that are circulating around now in terms of trying to either correct the problem by dealing with the trade side or correct the problem by dealing with the domestic production side. You basically have an imbalance, you have to rebalance them somehow. And I think all of those proposals probably have some role to play in passing legislation. The third issue is allocation. This was the big issue in the SO2 program. You have a trading program that's going to basically be dealing with about $100 billion worth of allowances every single year. As an economist, again, I'm kind of happy that a lot of the debate right now is tending towards auctions that would sell the allowances to whoever needs them, and the money would come back to the government. There probably is some need for free allocation, but that needs to be done very carefully towards those who really need it, or to try to dampen some of the price impacts on consumers. And then the fourth issue that looms kind of large in this debate is the question of preemption. What we have right now, because there is no federal mandatory legislation, is a number of states have pursued somewhat aggressive local policies, state and regional policies. In New England is probably the furthest ahead. They have a program that's supposed to start in 2009. California has authority to create a statewide program to hit a target in the next few years. And so the question is, if you have a federal program, what does that mean for these state programs going forward? Will there be some sort of a rule of preemption, or will it simply assume that these programs are going to go away naturally? But I think those are 4 very tough questions, and I think the question you have to ask yourself in terms of looking at the candidates is who's likely to be able to deal with these questions most successfully and pass legislation. And along those lines, I think it's important to realize that these questions are not just waiting for the candidate. These questions are being debated right now in the U.S. Senate and in other forum where people are actually trying to work through the issues. So one question that I ask myself is who's most likely to be able to pick up the mantle of what's been done and carry that all the way to the finish line. If people go back to 1990, when the first President Bush came into office, he basically picked up a blueprint for the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments that have been hashed out over the past few years. And in some sense, I think that's what we're looking at here, is we have a lot of work that's already been done, and we want a candidate who comes in and picks up that and figures out correctly what needs to be worked out, what's already been worked out, and walks through. So just kind of summarizing, in terms of what we see in the campaign, I think the differences are relatively small. I think it's not going to be the biggest campaign issue, since all 3 candidates have strongly endorsed mandatory controls. I will note that McCain is the sole candidate who kind of has a track record of having done this for the past 7 years, having proposed legislation back in 2001, but I don't necessarily think that means that he's any more sincere in his commitment than Obama or Clinton. And it all really comes down to who's going to be able to crack these 4 nuts that I've laid out, and perhaps some other ones that I haven't thought of. And there the question is who's going to work well with Congress to get these things through, because after the election there'll be a new president, there will not be an entirely new Senate, and all these problems that are there now will still be there. Thank you.
Wow, took away my role of telling him to shut up. Nikki, you want to go next?
Yes.
Following that good example?
Yep, absolutely. Thanks for having me here. I would tell a joke, but that's not my intent. It's one thing to have a, if you look at all the candidates' websites, sorry, I should never stop at my own applause, right? If you look at the candidates' websites, they all say something about climate change, and it's all good, and I agree with everything that Billy just said. But I think it's one thing to have a button on your website, and it's one thing to tell speeches to audiences that are really interested in a given issue. But it's another thing to campaign on an issue. What I'm not seeing, either because it's not being reported or because it's not happening, I think it's probably a combination of the two, is the candidates really campaigning on climate change. So I have a sad story that I need to tell you. This is a little bit of our history that a lot of us have forgotten, and it'd be a shame if we repeated it. The high watermark for federal climate policy was in 1992, when the United States was the third country in the world to ratify the Rio Treaty, which basically said climate change is a problem, we need to avoid dangerous human interference with the climate system. And in fact, it set out an aspirational goal that by the year 2000, we would bring our emissions back down to the 1990 levels. So we actually had a voluntary goal that the United States Senate ratified, third country in the world, back in 1992. However, the measures that we ratified in the Rio Treaty were voluntary. There was no binding commitments or anything of that sort. So then, and that was done, by the way, under George Herbert Walker Bush. In 1995, it was clear to all the parties of the Rio Treaty that we weren't going to make our goal of 1990 levels by 2000 with purely voluntary measures. So we said, okay, we got to do something mandatory. Let's do this. Let's have the developed countries take the first step. We're going to put caps on their emissions, reduce their emissions in some cases. We'll give the developing countries a pass, since they're poor and they have other issues to deal with, and technologically not the places where we're going to be developing the technology that we need to address this issue. That was 1995. The United States was part of that. Then in 1997, July of 1997, the Senate passed unanimously a resolution that basically repudiated that 1995 idea. It specifically repudiated the notion that developed countries should take a step before developing countries. And predictably, and then not predictably, and then a few months later in Kyoto, the administration signed on to a treaty that said, well, we're going to do exactly what we just said in the Senate we're not going to do, which is to have the developed countries cap their emissions before the developing countries. And then the administration came back and did not submit the Kyoto Protocol to a vote in the Senate, did not submit the legislation that would have put a cap on U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, the cap that would have been needed for us to comply with the Kyoto Protocol, and I think most importantly did not explain the issue to the American public. And politically, and by the way, I used to work in this building right across this nice green space here, so I have a little bit of a sense of the politics. Politically, that made sense. It would have been suicide, political suicide, to do any of those things. It would have been suicide for Al Gore, who was then essentially in cycle. It was too late. If they were going to have any shot at getting an international treaty through, at capping U.S. emissions, at having even a rational basis for the international negotiations, they had to have campaigned on it in 1996, when we knew that the treaty that we were part of was not going to be complied with by other than mandatory measures. We had to have campaigned on it in 1996. For lack of that, there was no political capital available to really do all the things that we needed to do to hit that treaty. And I'm deeply hoping that we don't repeat that history. And I see, it worries me that the candidates who all have great stands on climate change. McCain really has been, I think, before 1997, one of the top educators of the Senate on climate change. Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama have been very strong on the issue for their entire time in the Senate as well. So you can't fault them. Can't fault any of them on that, and I think it's, as Billy says, it's hard to distinguish between them on this issue. But I think that they're missing an opportunity, and we're all missing an opportunity in not campaigning on this issue, especially as we see high gasoline prices, electricity prices, all that, which are in part, and I would argue in large part, the result of an incoherent energy policy. We actually have an opportunity to speak rationally to the American public about what we ought to be doing on energy and climate policy and national security policy and all the other things that are tied along with it. And while there's a political risk to that, obviously there's always a political risk to speaking honestly about difficult topics. I would argue that we are seeing the least amount of political risk you could ever have with all the three candidates being pretty much in the same place, with even the Republican candidate being one of the national leaders on this issue. So I would hope that, and actually here's another thing. Here's another crazy thing. 3 candidates are senators. They're United States senators. In first week of June, the Senate Majority Leader Reid has said that we're going to have a vote on the Lieberman-Warner bill, the first economy-wide cap and trade bill to pass the Environment Committee and to really have a go at becoming law. These 3 candidates have, I think, a great opportunity to say, look, we need to be enacting this law this year, not next year, this year. There is an environmental imperative to acting now. There is a business imperative to acting now. And there would be much left for the president to do. Even if we enacted that law now, there'd be so much left for the president to do, including to take that bill and to negotiate for an international treaty in Copenhagen in 2009. So here's my pledge. The first candidate to start campaigning in a serious way on the issue gets my vote. Thank you.
Okay. I want to thank the sponsors for inviting President Bush's first-term energy advisor to this conference. That suggests that when we were in a very different place, of course, in the climate discussion, it suggests that I'm personally grateful that when it comes to climate change, the discussion occurs in a big tent. My views are going to be my own, not of Tudor Investment Corporation, and they come to you from the perspective of someone who spent most of his career trying to call it like he sees it. As an oil market analyst and a hedge fund policy analyst, my job is not to advocate, not to take sides. It is to accurately predict the timing and substance of political and policy trends and events that affect the market. So I have more to lose than just reputation. I lose money if I get it wrong. I've been focused very carefully on climate for the last several years. Tudor Investment was one of the founding members of the Green Exchange, a new vehicle off the NYMEX that is going to trade climate futures. So I've been following this very closely. I would make several observations very quickly, going from the big down to the small, and then look forward to the Q&A. First of all, climate change, let me back up for a second. In terms of investor consensus, I would say the change in the last year and a half has been that the science question has been politically resolved, and we are going to cap carbon in this country. Matter of fact, whereas 2 years ago, if you asked yourself how much of global GDP was governed by countries that put a carbon cap in place, you would have had a number close to 20, which is basically Europe. Now you're closer to 50. It's not just the US, it's Australia, it's Canada, and I expect Japan. So from an investor standpoint, if you're remotely sentient and looking out the window, you see that there's a political consensus to put a price on carbon, and that is literally an awesome development in terms of political, economic history. Secondly, it's going to take a few years for this policy to get finalized. And I'll go into some of the reasons why in a second. This will not happen quickly. This, unlike our recent biofuels policy, will be done with much more careful analysis and study of the cost consequences that Billy mentioned, very important. And if you look at the Clean Air Act model, we still are probably several years out from when the final bill will be enacted, much less go into effect. I know of my sense is the received wisdom in town among folks looking at this honestly is that you're probably looking at 2010, 2011 before consensus can be achieved. Now, the main points. First of all, climate change is an energy problem. It has to do with energy transformation because it's how it gets down at the end of the day to how we use energy. I've found that energy is subject to some of the most unrealistic rhetoric and expectations that we see in any top-tier public policy issues, starting back from when we entered our traumatic energy history in the early 1970s, and President Nixon declared we would be import-free by 1980. President Carter in the State of the Union address 1977 said we'll never import one more barrel than we imported that day. Since then, energy crises have been infrequent and fortunately short-lasting until now. But the response has typically been to reach for the stars in terms of promising huge things. And that gets to Billy's point, really when we're talking about 80% reduction by 2050 or what have you, we have to ask ourselves, is this realistic? You don't see similar types of claims and reaching with other top tier issues. When are we going to cure cancer? When are we going to end war? All these other types of things. You don't see these goals set like you do with energy. And again, energy is at the heart of climate. Secondly, the nature of this debate will not be ideological, not only because the three candidates basically agree and there's a political consensus to put a price on carbon. It will be like we see in many energy discussions, certainly I saw in the first couple of years of the Bush administration, a regional and a political one. It'll be coal state senators at odds with coastal state senators, energy producing states against energy consuming states and so forth. States that are concerned about competition and so forth with China, and pretty much, I think across the board, a desire to have cost containment. And that's one point I would like to emphasize from Billy, and that's something investors look at very carefully. There's a debate about whether there should be a safety valve price, whether it's right to have a safety valve price. From an investor standpoint, you probably don't want to see that. In an ideal world, we'd have a bill enacted next year that would clarify the rules and regulations, allow the market forces to work unconstrained, and we, the investors, would just get at it and start the fuel.
You can keep going, but I don't think everybody knows what the safety valve thing is. So
okay.
I'll give you the time. Just explain why,
okay.
what that is.
So a safety valve price, and Billy and Nikki, please correct me if I get this wrong, but a safety valve price is basically where you put a cost on, you put a cap on how high the cost of the program can go. Take, for example, Senator Bingaman's proposal for a cap and trade program. He would say, we're going to, like others, like Lieberman Warner, we're going to have a cap and trade program, we're going to have credit prices for carbon traded freely, driven by market forces. But he would say, if in the beginning they get up to $12 a ton, well, that's probably, you know, the highest we want to pay in the short term right now, because there's uncertainty about the costs. We're learning that with biofuels. There's uncertainty about the consequences of these mandates or cap and trade programs we put into place. So to control the uncertainty, at least initially, you might want to have a safety valve price. Others say you don't want to have a safety valve price. That interferes with market forces, that distorts signals for investors. One should let the market forces drive the price to whatever it is. There's one example here that's instructive with the European Union. The European Union's cap and trade program does not have a safety valve price. So Europe has basically said, we will achieve by force of law the reductions we've mandated at any price. Now, from an investor standpoint, that's not realistic. In our view, every society has a price, has a high price they will pay to achieve a policy aim. It may be explicit, it may be tacit, but they have it. Before the EUA prices, or the European carbon prices, collapsed in 2006 because of a one-off problem that I don't think is necessarily the death knell. I think the EU program is going to be fine. But there was, you may know, in 2006, prices got up to 35 euros a ton and then collapsed suddenly because there was an over-allocation to existing institutions, a technical problem, really. Before that, I can tell you, because I was reading the investor reports, the reports from the climate consultants and the banks and so forth, people who were very sympathetic with controlling climate, but they were watching the market develop. And I can tell you, on that run up to 35, everybody was asking themselves, what price in Europe is too high? At what price will German members of parliament say, we cannot lose any more cement jobs to Algeria, there must be some sort of a fix? And we were speculating about what sort of, you know, non-judicial, not transparent political intervention would occur in Europe to basically say, enough is enough, we misjudged. So all this is to say, whether it's a board like the Federal Reserve that decides how to control prices, or Senator Bingaman's safety valve price, or say there's going to be no safety valve price whatsoever, we'll pay everything. I think the political leaders would behoove them, as we go through the next few years of finalizing this program, to send credible signals to investors. Make sure it's credible. Make sure you have good estimates of the cost of achieving the program. I have a feeling I'm running over my time, and so I'm going to make one more point and then stop, and that is the window we have to operate in. It's fascinating. As I say, I think, and I think most people expect, we have a 2 to 3, maybe 4-year window to enact final policy. It's going to coexist with 3 other phenomena that are going to affect the debate that are very important. One is a slowing U.S. economy, and we see now with 2 of the 3 candidates supporting an immediate cut in the gasoline tax, some question about their real willingness to impose higher energy costs on consumers to achieve policy aims. I think that's important. Secondly, we're going to coincide, we think, with the beginning of a massive industrialization where basically 2.5, 3 billion people are going to show up to the OECD, 1 billion people, and say it's our turn to eat and drive. We're going to have the largest increase in energy demand we've ever seen in human history, and the IEA and other experts say 85% of that is going to be fossil fuel, whether we like it or not. That's going to drive costs up. It'll actually help the problem because it'll incentivize efficiency and alternative energy in and of itself. But it's also going to create a problem politically as we talk about raising costs to consumers. And thirdly, I suggest our electricity sector is going to be frozen. We're not going to build new coal. We're going to wait for 2 to 3 years while we figure, the power sector, while we figure out this climate policy. The problem is if you look at what the regulators say, 2 to 3 years from now, many regions in our country, including the one we're sitting in right here, is going to get very low on spare capacity. The risk of brownouts and blackouts is going to go up as we saw in California. In that environment, in my experience, when politicians are confronted with the loss of electricity supply, there will be a rush to clarify the rules and get new power up as soon as possible. I think that'll be natural gas because that's the fastest electricity you can get up. So I think this window is going to be fascinating to watch. Sorry to go on for so long, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you all. Let me ask a couple questions and then we'll turn it over. The assertion is there's a political consensus that the science is right, which is an interesting way to frame the statement, but let's take that as given. But all of you also suggested that there's a political consensus that the way to address this problem is through a cap-and-trade system which has at least the trappings of letting market forces work. How much it'll be market and how much it'll be regulation is up to debate, and I think we've seen some of that already. All of you seem to dismiss the possibility, although you mentioned it, Bill, that the economist's favorite solution, a carbon tax, will be politically unrealistic. Is that fair? Does anybody want to say why no carbon tax?
Well, my own view on the debate is that it doesn't matter that much, given that you can kind of graft the features of a tax onto a cap and trade by auctioning and having safety valves and things like that. It's seemed to me that the political forces have been pushing towards cap and trade just because the strongest advocates for policy, the environmental community, has wanted the certainty of a cap. And so I feel like that tends to be the vehicle most people embrace. I've heard a lot of people talk about the fact that as we get into the debate and people realize about how complicated this is going to be, and this cost containment issue looms large, and people are tired of high prices, there may be some desire to have more certainty about the price, to focus more on a tax. They need the government revenue to deal with the deficit and healthcare and everything else we're going to be talking about today. And then you come back to other policies to try to deal with some of the things that aren't going to be picked up by a CO2 price.
So the argument is that, please.
If I could just say, and just to clarify, the environmental community is not very supportive of a tax because, as Billy says, you don't have certainty about the emission levels that you're going to achieve. And especially given that tax debate in this country is poisoned. I mean, it's very difficult, maybe impossible, to have a rational discussion of tax policy in this country. So the expectation is that you would not get a tax anywhere near the level that you would need to drive the reductions. Also, another feeling is that at least early on in the program, we want to keep the money in the economy. A cap and trade program with a fairly high initial level of giving the allowances for free to industry actually keeps the money in the economy rather than bringing it into the federal coffers. And a lot of people think that's an important part of.
Well, wait a minute. You can if you're going to auction off. First of all, my prediction: if there's money to be made here, the government will take some of it. There's a lot of other things the government wants to do, and a nice way to raise. And if you can be for clean energy, clean environment, and raise money, man, I'd run on that program. But so if you auction off the permits, that is the same thing as a tax. It's just a question of which way you choose to collect the money.
I agree.
Right. So the difference is that the environmentalists say, I'd rather have certainty about what the carbon emissions are and let the price go wherever it wants to go. And the other side says, I'd rather have certainty about the price. We'll have X dollars on carbon, and we'll see how much the emissions are. And that seems to me that's the choice.
Actually, two slight things. The Lieberman-Warner bill, the Boxer Lieberman-Warner bill, right, which is the environmentalist dream at this point. It actually allocates for free 75% of the allowances to the emitters. So it doesn't keep the bulk of the revenue for the federal government. It actually keeps most of it out in the economy. And the thing about the last said about the emissions sort of fluctuating. And by the way, Senator Bingaman is tremendous, and he's been a tremendous leader on this forever, and I don't want to in any way cast aspersions on him. He's trying to find a rational path forward on this. But I will say that $12 safety valve that's in his bill has been projected by the Energy Information Administration to allow the emissions to rise pretty steadily. So it's not one of these. It's a projected increase.
Go to Wayne.
Yeah, no, I think here's the debate over P and Q. We can choose the P, price, or we can choose the quantity. Folks concerned about economic cost will want to choose the P. But if we choose the P, and it's a politically acceptable P, it's going to be something pretty low, like $12 a ton. As Nikki said, that's not going to remotely achieve the quantity reductions the environmental community believes is necessary. However, if we choose the Q, the question is how credible, especially a Q that achieves the reductions that are necessary, the question will remain on the table: how credible, how committed is the political community to paying whatever price is necessary to achieve that reduction? That's the difficult balance in the debate we're going to be in.
Let's start with questions. I don't think we have a mic, so you have to shout, please. We do have a mic, sorry. Why don't you say who you are and try and make it a question? That means it ends with a question mark.
I'm Marty Sullivan with Tax Analyst, www.tax.org. My question for the panel is, how do we put any credibility on candidates' commitment to cap and trade when they are simultaneously proposing gas tax hikes?
Cuts.
Anybody?
I raised that.
The credibility question?
I think the question is not the credibility of the commitment. The question is, as Bob suggested, what happens when the politics of higher energy prices, collide with climate change. At least the market-based approach to climate change. And my own gut feeling is that it's going to be very hard over the long run to sustain high energy prices created by a federal policy when people don't really connect the dots and see that that's why it's there. So my own guess is that at the end of the day, we're going to end up with something that involves a relatively modest price on CO2, coupled with complementary policies that encourage energy efficiency and R&D and probably regulate the heck out of a lot of sectors that are energy intensive. It's not my fantasy as an economist. I think it'll be extremely expensive for the economy, but I do worry that we will not, I wonder if we were going to have the commitment to keep high prices from a federal regulation.
I'm reminded of a Democrat I know, a prominent Democrat I know, who, a bit disgusted with this debate, said to me, "I'm a good Democrat, good liberal Democrat. Just tell me, am I for low energy prices or high energy prices?"
In fairness to the candidates, to all the candidates, the gasoline, just to focus on one, the gasoline price increase that we've seen is exactly, from a climate change perspective, from a climate policy perspective, in my opinion, exactly the wrong thing. We basically went for years and years and years with very low gasoline prices. And suddenly, and that meant that people got invested in big cars. They got invested in homes miles away from where they work. We built communities around those two notions. And so all of a sudden we went like this. That's exactly what we don't want to do. A good climate policy should not do that. It should be somewhat predictable. But that said, I do agree that while I think it's legitimate to decry the effect that these suddenly high gasoline prices have on especially the poorest in our society, I wish they were talking at the same time about what a coherent energy policy would be.
Can I just add one bit of information?
Sure. Information. Wait.
Yeah.
That's not
if you're talking about $15 a ton of CO2, you're talking about household electricity bills going up about 10 to 15%. When you start talking about $30 or $40 a ton of CO2, you're talking about a 30 to 40% increase in household electricity bills. So if they're bearing the full cost, now you could depress the effect on households through an allocation to the power sector or other people in the power sector. But if they're bearing the full cost, it's going to be a not trivial increase in their power bills.
Question here.
Thank you. My name is Azarian from the Royal Netherlands Embassy. I wanted to ask, you're all talking about the costs, but there are also there are a lot of benefits, and you can create jobs by actually changing that policy. And I think personally we have a tax in Europe and it works just fine because the consumers have an incentive to use less energy instead of putting all the lights on in a house, put them off. And that's what I see here in the US. People just consume without being aware that there is a price on it. So basically I wanted to know how you think about the policy plans of the candidates with regard to energy resources, diversification, and also about the positive effects of changing the policy, which can also create jobs.
Okay, let's take the basic part of your question, which is that we're talking about the cost of this, and she's asserting that there could be a lot of good benefits, jobs and such, created by more coherent energy policies. Anybody? Bob, you want to?
Yeah, no, I think there's no question about that. However, there is a transition. There are winners and losers, and there are industries and conventional fuel sources and people who produce them in the states, communities that benefit from them that will be adversely affected. I think that's clear in any of the nonpartisan analyses you see, whether it's from the Environmental Protection Agency or the Department of Energy. We will debate the magnitude and the timing, but there's clearly winners and losers. My experience with politicians are they're more, and since the benefits tend to come in the longer term, that they'll be more concerned about the near-term losers. They will be a little louder and a little more effectual in the political process than the winners and the new entrants in the green jobs. I think it's just a political reality. I think that's accurate.
The one thing I'd like to add is that a lot of people talk about how complicated climate policy is. It actually really isn't that complicated. I worked on toxics for 15 years. Toxics, that's complicated because it's essentially impossible to compare the value of the risk of death due to associated with air pollution to the risk of a birth defect associated with contaminants in water. With climate change, the one break we got on this is that greenhouse gases are essentially fungible. If we can reduce a ton here in Washington, it's just as good as reducing a ton in Houston or a ton in Beijing. And so what that allows us to do with this cap and trade mechanism, or even a tax mechanism, is to send a uniform signal throughout the economy to the homeowners, to manufacturers, to electric companies, that actually allows us to find the most economical means.
But do you guys really think that there's a consensus among the people of the United States that global climate change is such a big deal that all of us should, in one way, shape, or form, pay more for energy?
Here, let me. Polling shows that people are concerned. Do they understand the urgency of this? No. But let me again reach back to history. In the 50, 60-year history of U.S. environmental legislation, here's what typically happens. Scientists talk about an issue mostly through the peer-reviewed press. Nobody much pays attention. A couple of environmentalists will pick up the issue and start to amplify it. Some mostly junior members of Congress will start talking, introducing bills, debating it on the floor. You look back in the early 60s, you see Ed Muskie and Rebekov talking about air pollution. Time magazine puts the issue on its cover, no offense. Somewhere along the line, but then somewhere along the line, there is an event. Love Canal, the burning of the Cuyahoga River, Bhopal, that crystallizes the public's understanding of the urgency of the issue. And then there's a rush to get legislation. Doesn't matter who's in office, President Nixon, Reagan, doesn't matter who's controlling Congress, Democrats, Republicans, you will get a law. My belief, and actually my concern, is that we have to experience that event before we legislate. And the reason I'm concerned about it is that you don't make the best decisions when you're rushing.
Do you think there's a consensus to pay more for energy for this purpose?
I think it's going to be, let me just respond a little bit to Nikki's point, and then I actually want to refute a little bit of what they said in terms of the green jobs questions. I think there does need to be an event. I worry that the event, unlike the other things we've had in the past that have kind of motivated clean water laws and clean air laws and toxic laws, I worry about the ability to sustain that over a long period of time in the face of recognition that it's government policy that's raising prices. All those policies that came out of that, the costs were a lot more hidden. I mean, no one knows what the cost of the Clean Air Act is unless they read OMB reports. But everybody's going to look at their energy bill and look at their gasoline bill, well, less on the gasoline, but certainly on some of their electricity bills, and they're going to know, people are going to be telling them that this is 40% higher or 15% higher because of a CO2 price. So I do worry about the ability to maintain that over time. I mean, I hope we are, but I'm worried about it. And I also worry about the fact that it may happen so far down the road in terms of the problems that it'll be too late to do something serious about it. But I just want to speak to the green jobs issue because this is something that comes up a lot. And I really want to emphasize three things. One is there are two ways that environmental regulation can help and you can have net benefits. One is pretty obviously energy efficiency. We know there's lots of energy efficiency losses throughout the economy. The problem is prices on energy right now are not encouraging us to get rid of those. So I would posit that higher energy prices are not going to necessarily get rid of them either. This is kind of a cultural, societal change, and I don't know how we get to it or how we regulate it, but I'm not convinced that just putting a market price in CO2 is going to change behavior that exists even now when we have high energy prices. The second point, or the second way this can happen, is if somehow innovation in the energy market, and the clean energy market, has dramatic spillovers throughout the economy. You know, you invent Velcro for outer space processes, and it turns out to be really handy for making everybody's clothes. I mean, those sorts of spillovers have benefits throughout the economy. If we come up with clean energy battery technology that has broad applications, that could have really important spillovers that benefit everybody. But generally, spillovers happen in every part of the economy. They happen in healthcare, they happen in biotech, and nanotech, and agricultural, and everything. So the question is, do we expect higher spillovers in our energy sector than we necessarily expect in other sectors that we may be depleting as we put R&D into this area? And finally, the green jobs that we are creating, if they are simply replacing other industries that are doing the same thing cheaper now, even though the green jobs are doing it cleaner, that is not a net savings to the economy. We're doing the same thing, we're producing power or fuel for our cars, and we're getting the same utility out of that at a higher price. So for society, it's a cost. There may be a new industry that's created, and that's great for the people in the industry, as Bob suggested. There's another industry that was lost. And until we get the prices in that new industry below the old industry, it's a net cost.
Question here?
Hi, Jim Hurst, staff at the U.S. House of Representatives. Mr. McNally, you mentioned that you follow the investments of cap and trade programs around the world. I wonder, can you tell us how cap and trade has affected Europe's international competitiveness, and if we can draw any parallels for regulating cap and trade in the U.S.?
Right. It's still very early days. We just finished the trial period for the European carbon trading system, and as I said, it was kind of a bust, I think, as even some European officials will recognize, and not in a totally bad way. It was a learning experience. Prices went up to 35 euros or so and then collapsed again because of a one-off technical problem. So I don't think we have a lot of evidence yet. We're now coming into the real phase. My friend from the Netherlands Embassy can probably elaborate in terms of the real credit trading program. I'm aware that there are concerns, especially in Germany and so forth, that the rising fuel costs plus the added carbon costs, and remember, whether you do it through an explicit tax or you allocate credits to the emitters for free, as Nikki said, but then the price has to be passed along in the form of the energy price. At the end of the day, you're making problems worse for the Germans, for example, cement industry, petrochemical industry, and you're seeing a lot more of that leave to North Africa. So I'm aware that the European political community is very concerned about the competitive impacts of the carbon trading scheme. You didn't learn too much from the first one because it was very wobbly, and I know as they work through the rules of especially the scheme that's going to follow after 2012, they're looking at ways to either allocate credits freely or provide other subsidies to offset the hits to competitiveness. So there's sort of a general impression, but it's really
How would you rank the competitiveness risk of this stuff versus $1.60 on the euro and labor market problems that prevent them from moving work?
I would say so far it's low.
Is there another question?
Actually, can I just comment?
Sure.
Yesterday morning, I actually was part of a panel speaking to a group of European parliamentarians, and at least to hear them tell it, the effect, you know, as Bob says, the first phase of the emissions trading system in Europe was really a learning phase. It was in fact specifically designed for that. Right now, I think the prices are pretty stable. Yeah, the second phase prices are pretty stable. These parliamentarians who have to, stand, as they say, for election, back home, were saying, well, look, compared to other stuff that's going on, even including the U.S. mortgage crisis, this is a blip. This isn't really affecting them. And in fact, they were scolding us. We're a bunch of think tank folks up there. They were scolding us, and through us, the United States, for not getting on board this thing.
Now, let me ask you a question about, you made a very good point, that unlike some of the issues that we're going to discuss here today, this one is very hard to solve one country at a time. That is, if we reduce our emissions and China and Japan and Europe don't reduce theirs, they get the benefits of our reduction and we pay a lot of costs. What in the current environment leads you to believe that we might actually, how difficult does that make this problem?
That's the big question. That's the hard one. The easy one's actually domestic policy, but the hard one is what do you do about China? I think there's actually a lot of things that we can do, and I think there's an open question of what happens once the United States takes action and exerts leadership. I think it may be a lot harder for other countries to walk away from the table than they can right now, and it's easy for them to point to us and say, look, the United States isn't really doing anything. And actually outside the European Union, there aren't that many other countries that have anything on the books. So I think once the United States takes action, I think that really is a game-changing sort of event at the international level, and we don't know what's going to happen. I also think that when we design our domestic program, there are a lot of things you can put into it that'll help at that level. So you can insert conditionality. You can say, if other countries do this, then we will do that, and actually have it in the law. You can have incentives in terms of funding. You can have incentives in terms of trade restrictions. So I think you can give yourself a lot of tools to deal with the international community, and that should be part of the domestic policy debate.
Is there a question? Let me, in the back. This gal.
I'm Brian, I'm a student. I know this is supposed to be on climate change, but I think we're talking about energy costs, so I think it's relevant. I was wondering what you did think about the gas tax holiday.
Okay.
There's disagreement among the candidates.
So the question is, we have John McCain and Senator Clinton advocating a gas tax holiday and Senator Obama not. What do you make of this?
I don't think it'll be enacted. I think it's perceived as a kind of a temporary public, I don't want to use the word gimmick, but why not? And imagine though, come September, Labor Day, maybe oil will be back at $60 a barrel and gasoline will be $2 a barrel, we all hope. But maybe the summer is going to be hot, maybe the Middle East is going to heat up, maybe crude oil is going to be $130 or $140, maybe gasoline will not be lower. Can you imagine having to reinstate an 18 cents a gallon federal gasoline tax after Labor Day, 2 months before the election? So,
I think it's safe to say that none of the economists think this makes any sense. It wouldn't lower gasoline prices that much. A lot of the benefit would go to the people who sell gasoline because there is supply and demand. And secondly, it is sort of weird to be in a situation where the candidates agree we ought to raise the price of energy, except not now. Let me close on a final question. It seems to me that I want to offer you an alternative way of looking at this, that America makes changes not only when it gets price signals. That is, somehow smoking became less socially acceptable, and it wasn't only because we raised the price of cigarettes by taxing them. There was something that happened. So I just wondered if you could speculate outside, the hard economic analysis, to what extent might this policy be driven by a kind of Al Gore-led young people's crusade in which the market mechanism becomes the way it's implemented rather than the driving force? Do you want to try it? Right? Sure?
You go ahead.
I think there does have to be cultural change. I think it has to be, I think that cultural change does have to be reflected in policy. But what's most important is cultural change. Al Gore, by the way, I think is doing great work. But in Truth and Disclosure, my sister-in-law works for him. So, but having said that, I hope there will be strong Republican voices who take up this charge as well, because I don't think just Al Gore will penetrate.
Well, my brother's a lawyer, so I don't think anybody should have to pay for their siblings' sins. Huh?
I think the chances are very low that climate change is an issue, or any event related or purportedly related to climate change will create the political will necessary to sustain the types of energy cost increases that are needed to achieve the Qs, the reductions that the environmental community are talking about. I don't see it. I think what's more likely, I think there's probably a consensus to put a modest cost in, as Billy said. I think the only plausible scenario where we create and sustain meaningful support for cost changes and societal changes that affect our climate, our greenhouse gas emissions, is one in which we subsume it back into energy, and we reform our tax code to increase energy taxes, shift the burden from savings, investment, and work to consumption of all things, including carbon, in the name of energy security, national security, economic security, and, I hate to say it, but it's true, I think, as a subcomponent of that, climate change. I don't think that the climate change will ever rise to the level of national security or economic security.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with Bob. I also think that we will solve this problem primarily when we begin to have cultural and societal change in the way people think about these things. I mean, it's happened in other parts of the world. I think it's happened here. And it probably hasn't happened as much as it needs to in other parts of the world. But I think the kinds of prices are going to be part of it. Other regulatory elements are going to be part of it. I would love to have the tax reform that Bob talks about. What economists wouldn't? But I think at a basic level, people are going to have to get used to the idea that driving a big car is not cool. And when that happens, we'll have some changes.
The only thing I'll say is that if you feel that we won't ever have enough societal support for these for the increases because of climate change, my sense is that that reflects not a complete understanding of what the science is telling us, because the science is really preparing us for some fairly significant events.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your questions and your participation, and we'll move right on. And I will have the ceremonial changing of the placards. You want someone else to push the button?
Actually, it's only 3 slides.
Oh, good. Okay. Thank you. Okay, this isn't the break, guys. The break comes after healthcare. So, Joe Antos, I saw you here. Glenn? To keep us on schedule, I'm going to introduce the panelists while you all retank on caffeine. So now we turn to healthcare reform, which is one of those low-stakes, unemotional issues, unlike carbon change. I guess part of the solution here is if we can get enough climate change, we can drown a lot of people. We won't have healthcare costs so high, and so maybe they're related. Our panelists here are 3 people who have done lots of panels on healthcare. John Shields from the Lewin Group, which is often quoted as an arbiter of what makes sense in healthcare policy. Joe Antos, who's going to go second, from the American Enterprise Institute, who's also been in government at CBO, and has a little bit more on the conservative side. And Len Nichols is with the New America Foundation and was involved in, among other things, some of the stuff during the Clinton healthcare initiative that didn't quite work out. So we're going to start with, you know, thanks, Dave. As Senator Moynihan said after they finished the Social Security work with Alan Greenspan, and someone said, "What about the baby boom?" He said, "It's important to leave some problems for the next generation to solve." So John's going to start for about 7 or 10 minutes and talk about the campaigns, and then I understand we said Len's going to go next, and then Joe.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I need to remember this place as a place for my daughter's wedding. Seems any champagne?
The rule was 1 tent joke per person, and you just exposed that you weren't here at the beginning of the program. I'm really looking forward to the last 10 jokes of the day. You're going to be really.
Still going to look into it.
Do you want me to
not yet. Let me just open up. We're with the Lewin Group, and the Lewin Group is a nonpartisan organization. We do a lot of work. I personally do a lot of work on estimating the cost and coverage impacts of health reform proposals. Today, we are going to talk about tax policy as it relates to healthcare. Tax policy, it's been suggested by a number of candidates. It's been suggested by, and it's in legislation proposed on the Hill, that we replace the tax exclusion for health benefits, employer-provided health benefits, with, say, a deduction or a tax credit. And I want to talk a little bit about the background on that, just what do we mean when we talk about the tax exclusion for health benefits. When we get our coverage from our employer, the value of that coverage is not taxable to us. Nationally, employer health spending is about $650 billion. And that's an income to individuals that we don't declare as taxable income. Now, if you were being paid in the form of a house or a car, IRS would make you impute the value of that and pay taxes on it. But with health benefits, we're off scot-free. And we've got into our first slide here, we look at quantifying the amount of the tax expenditure. Just push down, the first arrow down. Just the, yeah, oh my gosh, good. Almost stuff. Basically estimate a tax expenditure of $245 billion. That's about 90% of that is the tax expenditure with the federal government. The tax expenditure at the state level is about $25 billion. A lot of states, 85% states tie their adjusted gross income to the federal. So so it turns out about 90% of tax exclusion is federal. If you look on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see a breakdown on just the form of it. As a worker, the exclusion you have on your benefits in personal income taxes is about $115 billion. You also don't have to pay taxes on it when you calculate your Social Security payroll taxes, which is another 30% or another $64 billion. And for discussion purposes or reference purposes, we put in some estimates of what the other tax expenditures are. One of them would be the out-of-pocket deduction for health spending. You have expenditures in excess of 7.5% of AGI. You get to take a deduction for the amount over 7.5% of your AGI. And that actually turns out to be pretty important for aging people. The next slide shows the distribution of those tax expenditures by income group. We've got $220 billion in federal tax expenditures, and about half of it goes to people with incomes of $75,000 or more. At progressively lower incomes, you find a smaller and smaller portion of it attributed to those lower income individuals. There are a couple of problems created by this, or a couple of issues created by it. First of all, the people at the higher incomes are the ones who are going to benefit most from the tax exclusion. They're more likely to have health benefits from work, and they're also at higher marginal tax rates. So the exclusions were, say, 35 cents on the dollar, whereas for some of the lower income group, it might be worth 10 or 15 cents on the dollar. Another issue with it is that while we do have a tax exclusion for the employer-provided benefits, there is no tax break for people purchasing non-group coverage, individual insurance to go out and purchase on their own. And that creates a real equity consideration, because why is it that one worker who has employer coverage gets a tax break, but another worker with identical characteristics, identical income, who has to go out and buy the insurance on their own, they don't get any tax break? So there's a real equity consideration there. And then economists moan and groan a lot, and I think they're right, frankly, about some of the incentives created by this. What we're doing here is we're giving favored treatment to purchase of health care. That can encourage people to say, well, I want to take as much of my health care as possible in the form of, or my income as possible in the form of insurance. And that drives up the value of the insurance that people are purchasing, and that can lead to overuse of the healthcare system. So there are a number of concerns with it. If you turn to the next chart, we look at some of the little more information on the average value of these tax expenditures. The average per family is about $750, and as you can see, for those, the distribution is pretty much skewed so that the people at the higher end of the distribution are getting as much as $3,400 in tax benefit out of it, whereas families at the lower end of the distribution are getting relatively small amounts of it. Now, a number of proposals have been suggested that would change this picture. They would lower the amount of tax benefit that people at higher income levels are getting, and increase the amount at the lower income levels. And one of the plans that would do that is Senator McCain's plan, as we understand it now, which would have a tax credit in it for everybody who gets private insurance. And the tax credit is a fixed dollar amount, up to $5,000 per family. It wouldn't be reduced it's the same dollar amount for anybody regardless of their income. So that you'd have quite an increase in the tax incentive there. The tax incentive for the people lower end of the distribution would take better. Now, I put in some numbers here on the President's tax reform plan, which we're going to skip for purposes of the time. But I think what is interesting about the policies that have come up here on the tax exclusion is that you don't have to increase people's taxes to do away with the exclusion. You could provide typically the proposals first eliminate the exclusion, which adds a couple $100 million to people's tax payments. But they also give you another deduction or an exclusion or a credit, which further reduces your expenditures. And most of the proposals out there would on average actually reduce taxes for people. So you don't have to increase people's taxes to tax the health benefits exclusion. So I'm going to let that, leave it at that, and let these gentlemen tell you about the campaign and the proposal.
Well, I'm Len Nicholson of the American Foundation, and I won't make a tent joke, but I will say I think it's the first time I've ever given a talk inside a museum. And I feel like, you know, between Joe and John and I, we are kind of like wax figures. We're sort of middle-aged, balding guys who talked about healthcare for 20-something years. So, but Dave's right. We have left it for the next generation. Hopefully we can solve it in the next 3 years. What Joe and I thought would be a little more entertaining than the typical thing, because we know you're not really a health crowd, is for me to explain what I like about McCain, and Joe to explain what he likes about the Democrats. And then we'll switch, and I'll say what I don't like about McCain, and he'll say what he doesn't like about Democrats. We thought it would be better to go for, you know, what I like about McCain, he likes about Democrats, because that would enable the presentations to be shorter. But also, it allows us to really convey what I know all of us believe sincerely, that if we're going to do health reform, it's got to be bipartisan. And so we want you to see, in fact, there's a fair bit of common ground here. So, what I like about John McCain's health policy. First, he has one, and you know, it's actually progress in some fronts. Well, some candidates didn't. Second, seriously, he uses tax credits instead of tax deductions, which means he actually understands, thanks to Doug Holteken and some others, I'm sure, that in fact, tax credits can work far better for the people who don't have insurance. That would be the low-income population by and large. And by using tax credits versus tax deductions, you can make the subsidies as progressive as you kind of want to. Second, by using the tax expenditure that John just outlined, and he's documented quite faithfully, and we're all grateful to him for doing that over the years, it's such a huge pot of money. It makes perfect sense to use that to finance your health reform, because it's both fair and prudent to do so. You know, there's a lot of discussion about can we afford health reform, and I submit to you, if we, A, I would say we can't afford not to, but B, and I'd be glad to talk about that later, but B, if we use the tax expenditure money, of course we can afford to. Third, I would say the truly innovative part of the McCain proposal is that he's the first Republican candidate in my professional lifetime to actually talk about supply side reforms. A lot of people talk about demand side reforms, like we need to raise cost sharing and make people more prudent customers. But the supply side is something the Republicans tend to stay away, the Democrats tend to stay away from the demand side. So for McCain to actually talk about delivery system transparency, price and quality comparison, Medicare payment reform, these are things the AMA is not in favor of. So I will say, whatever you may think of John McCain in general, he is still the maverick on health care because he's willing to take on these entrenched interests that have stopped serious reform going forward. So let me stop there and let Joe do his part. We'll switch.
Thanks, Len. Okay, so what do I like about the Democrats' plan? The best thing is it's not a 1,500-page bill. But there's still time. Well, perhaps seriously, I think there are a couple of big issues that they do reasonably well. First of all, at least they started out saying the cost matters. Obama still says cost matters. Hillary Clinton knows the cost matters, but in the attempt to differentiate herself from Obama, which frankly is very, very difficult on health policy, she's not talking about cost, But let's give her credit, her very first speech was in fact about healthcare costs. So that's a very good perspective. Second, both of them have elements of consumerism that might surprise people. For example, they both talk about some sort of an organization modeled after either the Federal Employees Health Benefits Program or the Massachusetts Connector that gives people a chance for, you might call it one-stop shopping for health insurance. As you probably know, or you might not know, because you probably all have employer-sponsored coverage. If you know, where would you look to buy health insurance if you weren't getting it from your employer? It's a good question. The market isn't that organized. What these two candidates, in fact, what all the candidates really talk about is that we need to have some way of organizing the market to make it possible to actually buy insurance. Both Democrats talk about subsidizing individuals through tax credits, which is a remarkable change over the last 10 or 15 years. In that regard, Republicans seem to have won. Now everybody talks about tax credits. 15 years ago, no. And then better information about cost and quality. You can't have a consumer-driven system without people actually knowing what they're buying. Everybody talks about it. It's good to talk about it. We'll see. Finally, another thing going back to this business about cost is the admission that health reform will actually cost more money, not save money. That's really an important point. They're lowballing their figures. $110 billion for Clinton, Obama $65 billion. Yeah, that's fully phased in when all sorts of miracles occur and all sorts of savings happen. Let's face it, in the near term, and by the way, when is it never not the near term, costs will be here. They will be higher. Savings will be off on the horizon somewhere. Savings always come later if they come at all. Let's now turn to that.
Very good. Okay, now for what I really think. I think that, no, Joe, that was great. That was actually quite, I would agree with all of that, including the lowballing, but you know, they're politicians. The second part of this is what I don't like about the McCain plan. Really only two things. One, he does not commit or even pay homage to the notion that we should cover all Americans. Now, my view, we are going to do that eventually. I may be dead, and my grandchildren may be speaking in museum tents 100 years from now, I don't know, but we will, and we should. And I would submit to you, we can do this a heck of a lot smarter. Like Joe just said, we can agree on tax credits, we can agree on private markets, we can agree on lots of stuff. If we would just agree to cover everybody, then the debate will be about how, not whether. And then we talk about how to do it on a bipartisan way. As long as you draw a line and make it ideological, it is not necessarily a partisan issue. It does not have to be a partisan issue. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. There are lots of Republicans who do support covering all Americans. It would be incredible if McCain would come around. Now, I will say, if he wins, we could have a Nixon-China moment. Stay tuned. Second, buying across state lines. This phrase might be one of those Frank Luntz words that work. It sounds fantastic. You know, how can you oppose buying insurance from any place you want, any place on the planet? Gosh almighty, why should you be stuck with these silly rules that, you know, Idaho or Texas or Massachusetts might force upon you? Well, this is a great example of ideology trumping policy. Buying across state lines really means deregulating the individual insurance market. Now, you know, the technical flaw in the McCain plan is he gives people tax credits, but he sends them off into the non-group market, the individual market. I honestly, as an analyst, can think of no quicker path to single-payer health care than to have every American out trying to buy insurance in the non-group market on their own. Why? Because insurers are not charities. If you don't have guaranteed issue, and you don't have mandates, and you don't have rules to try to make them work for everybody, then insurers have to underwrite. They have to assess us. They have to charge me and John and Joe a hell of a lot more than you charge Elizabeth and Sarah who work for me. And that makes okay sense as long as we're healthy. But when you're not, they're not going to cover you at all. And so about 50 to 75 million Americans would discover what actuarially fair really means. And I submit we'd have Medicare for all in about a week if we did that. So you don't really want to go that way. And to say you do, everybody knows it won't work, it won't pass, it won't get out of committee. There's no way in hell anybody serious would let it happen. So to propose it is pure ideology, and they should just be smarter about that. And I will say, The deal here is there's a need to pay homage, and I forgive all sins in the primary. I understand running South Carolina is not France. You know, you got to say these things. But let me just say, laissez-faire is a great model. It works for lots of markets. It does not work for health insurance, because health insurance is not ice cream. The point of market rules, the point of regulation, the point of smart government, that's not a contradiction in terms, it's just a possibility. The point of smart government is to set the rules so that self-interest is channeled to serve the public interest. In insurance markets, that means you want to make sure the value proposition, that you can make a lot of money if you organize care smartly, get the right providers, and you actually make people healthier. What we do with selling across state lines is we say, we want you to make money selecting risk, including the sick and covering the healthy. That's a stupid way to make money. It's a stupid way for society to try to pursue its interests, because that's what led us to 47 million uninsured. Thank you.
Which is it? It's a dislike. It's dislike. Dislike Democrats. Oh, okay.
Sorry, we're confused.
All right. Now I'm confused. I was going to dislike McCain.
Feel free.
And let me mention one of the things I dislike most about his stance. He is just as anti-market as Hillary Clinton is in some ways. He talks about some kinds of regulations that in fact Senator Clinton would warmly endorse with regard to insurers and drug companies. Okay, now dislikes about the Democrats' plan. You know, they make promises that simply can't be kept. I mean, even for politicians, the promises are extreme. Universal coverage. You know, this is really a great phrase. Any serious analyst would admit that you can't do it unless you print up cards and give everybody a card that doesn't necessarily mean anything. And that's not what we want anyway. We don't want universal coverage per se. We want people to have access to appropriate health care. And by the way, that insurance card that's in your pocket doesn't do it either. You're getting good care, bad care, indifferent care, inappropriate care, appropriate care, too much, too little. You don't know, and fortunately, your doctor doesn't either. So, you know, it's a good system. Okay, what? Coverage as good as your congressman's. Okay, well, you know, we're right next to Congress, and would everybody get coverage as good as their congressman? Only if we put all of our money and all of the money that the Chinese are willing to lend us into healthcare can't be done. Affordable coverage. What does that mean? Unless you do something about controlling costs, this is a lesson in Massachusetts. To argue that you can just set an arbitrary limit on what people will have to pay without going after the hard stuff is typical politics. Nobody likes to talk about the hard stuff. That sounds like taking something away. You can't get elected that way. But let's face facts, we're going to have to deal with it. And then finally, the huge range of health plan options that both Democrats offer. You can enroll in any plan you like, as long as it's one we already approve. So, you know, that's a good promise. It overregulates. Mandates on people to buy coverage. You know, I think a mandate on everybody in this tent to buy coverage is a good idea. Why? You can afford it. A mandate on people who can't get into the tent, forget it. It isn't going to work. It's not working in Massachusetts. It isn't working because it costs too much money. So we're going to have to come up with a huge amount of money. Insurance regulation. I won't go through the details except to say that Clinton and Obama essentially would tie up hands and feet of insurers and then say, okay, now run down, you know, let's have a race. Let's see you get to the 50-yard line. It's going to be very difficult for them, especially if there is a government fallback plan that's just like Medicare. Because what does just like Medicare mean? It has more power to do things because it has legal authority to do things that private companies can't do. Okay, overspending. Huge subsidies will be necessary to come even close to universal coverage. Expansions of public programs will cost a lot of money. Where's that money going to come from? The answer is we're going to tax the rich. We're going to get rid of those Bush tax cuts, and we're going to do it as many times as necessary to pay for all of this stuff. And then finally, Len's most very important point about driving towards Medicare for all or a single-payer health system. You know, the fact is that the Democrats have the edge on Republicans now, it seems to me. If you, in fact, tie up the private insurance companies in knots, and you create a Medicare for all, and you provide gigantic subsidies to people, and you basically make the offer to employers, look, you don't really have to offer coverage to your employees anymore because, look, there's a very good plan here. In fact, it's actually better than one that you've ever offered before, and it takes the financial liability right off your backs. What do you think they're going to do? So we have a much better chance of going to Medicare for all under Democrats, but oh, that's the idea.
Well, that was great. I guess the bottom line is we're going to get Medicare for all no matter who wins.
I disagree on that.
Do you want to weigh in?
Well, I guess I would add that we spend a great deal of time working with people who write these bills. And some of them don't talk about financing it. Some of them do try to talk about financing and find a way to pay for it. And what we found is that if you work at it hard enough, you can probably come up with some ways of paying for the plan that aren't that onerous for any one group. The difficulty is that you have to be prepared to ask people to contribute more, at least at certain income levels. You're going to have to talk about standardizing things and so on. I'm not so pessimistic about our ability to put together a universal coverage plan that can be paid for. It's just that we have to go in with the understanding that we do have to pay for it. We can't have bills with $100 billion deficits to it.
I don't know, we did it for Medicare prescription drugs, and that worked out all right. I'm thinking that, so now we've learned that we have to pay more for energy for the good of the climate. We have to pay more for health care, no matter what happens. And I suppose someone will say, well, there's a harmonic convergence, we'll just pay more for energy and use the money to pay for health care. My guess is the problem is we'll spend the money on health care first, and then later we'll figure out how to pay for it. Questions here, or should I try them? Yeah, in the front.
Question for all the panelists.
Identify yourself, please.
Bill Irwin with the Alliance for Health Reform. Would you all discuss a little more the cost containment proposals of the candidates and whether you think these proposals, if they became law or regulation, would actually work?
Okay. Would the cost containment proposals work?
Well, first I would certainly agree with Joe that if you look at the Democratic, I would say, proposals in their totality on the web pages, not what gets reported on a daily ticker pad in the North Carolina or Pennsylvania debate. They do devote a lot of attention to this, and I think as Joe said, if you look at just the way Senator Clinton rolled her whole thing out, she started with cost, and then quality 2 months later, and then coverage 2 months after that, and that was meant to be a signal, and the signal was, I do get it. And Obama's got essentially the same cost containment mechanisms, a little bit of tweaking here or there. It's not worth our time to distinguish among them. The big question, of course, is the one you asked, would it actually work? And the truth is, none of us know for sure, but a lot of smart people have figured out that, in fact, the pieces that we know have to be there, we're just not quite sure how to connect them really fast, is electronic information infrastructure. There's no question we need not just electronic records, but decision support tools so that every clinician-patient encounter actually has the benefit of what we know that works now. In fact, there are systems in this country that do that. They're scattered and they're not everywhere, and yada yada, Kaiser, Intermountain Healthcare, Geisinger in Pennsylvania, Mayo, they're doing it right. And some other less organized systems are doing better too, but we don't have it nationwide. Second, there's no question, and I think this is where Joe and I and John would all agree, the fundamental problem in the healthcare system is misaligned incentives. And again, this is progress for Democrats to recognize that market incentives really matter. It's the first time in my lifetime it's ever been done. Okay, so that's good news. And what realigned incentives mean is that we need to pay clinicians to actually keep people healthy and to get them healthy fast, as opposed to paying them for stuff. Now we pay them to do stuff. For some docs, an imaging device in their office is like an ATM machine. Well, let's just take one more look. And the truth is no one can stop it.
So we've got to start paying for health and stop paying. On the consumer-driven side, there's no question we need to give correct incentives to patients. Similarly, as the doc with the ATM machine over here, we call it MRI. Patients shouldn't get an MRI just because their head hurts and their cousin got one. You know, and in fact, it's sometimes just go home, take an aspirin, you'll be fine. So making people pay the marginal cost of stuff that's not going to add value. We've got to stop collective financing of low-value care. And this is, we don't know everything. God knows. You know, you don't want to know how much art there is as opposed to science, but I can tell you there's a hell of a lot of science, and we're not following it right now, and we could if we had the right incentives and better information. And third, we've got to turbocharge the production of comparative effectiveness information, and that means get that best practice information spread and add to the knowledge base. You do those three things and you connect them, and I think the way to think about it is, you know, campaign documents are like watercolors. They're not photographs of blueprints that, you know, Jason Bourne would do. You know. It is a vision. And so think about the vision being a 10-year path. What we want to do in the next 2 years, in my view, is to agree as a nation. We're going to cover all our human beings, and we're going to move toward a more efficient system. It'll take a while. Joe's right, they're underballing what it would cost in year one. But you look at serious people looking at how we can bend that cost curve, we may be able to pay for it compared to baseline over a 7 to 10 year period.
Joe?
Yeah, of course, I largely agree with Len on almost everything, except 7 to 10 years, forget it. All the candidates, because all politicians do this, everybody embraces the things that sound easy. You know? So this is the downside. I agree with Len's comments about most of these good ideas. They are good ideas. But why do politicians embrace them? It's because there's no sense of sacrifice. And people hate sacrifice. It's not a great way to get a vote if you're asking them to sacrifice anything or actually to make a hard decision. So you know, health IT, this is going to save quadrillions of dollars. Not. Because if you don't use the information, then, you know, what difference did it make? And the fact is that health IT or a lot of these other things, including comparative effectiveness analysis, will have no impact unless we actually look at how care is delivered. This is one of the problems. That's the last thing we know about. How you get doctors to change what they do other than through brute force regulation or not so brute force money. But beyond that, you know, it's professionalism, it's education, there's a whole bunch of other things that we don't know much about. It's the culture of medicine, and we're not working on that. And there are no government grants to anybody to look at this issue that I know of. But everybody's enthusiastic about throwing potentially billions of dollars at scientific research. Well, we got a lot of scientific research. We're not using, as you said, we're not using the scientific research that we actually have.
But it's a chicken and egg thing. Do you think we shouldn't get the information until we figure out how to change doctors?
No, we got to do both. Okay. But if we pump billions of dollars into comparative effectiveness analysis and then put it on the shelf where it is inclined to sit, then it's a waste.
Just 30-second rebuttal. I would just say, oh, go ahead, John.
Well, we've spent some time looking at those. We've done estimates of variations on it for Commonwealth and others. And basically, the answer to your question, I'm afraid, is pretty close to no. There are no changes in incentives implied in a lot of these, in most of these provisions. Basically, if you don't hear providers expressing concern about it, it probably isn't going to work.
But it doesn't mean it's a bad thing to do, right?
But no, but I think that it's natural for candidates to propose all of these items where there's no rub to them at all. Nobody's going to get hurt. We're going to invest in IT. Everything's just going to get better. We're going to save $10 on the dollar invested. 4 years ago, it was disease management in the presidential campaign. We can all see how well that went. Now disease management is passé, and now we're on to IT and clinical trials research. If you take some of those things and you couple them with changes in incentives, you do clinical trials research, but then pay doctors less if they don't follow the guidelines, now you're talking about something that might have an effect. Until you get to that point, the answer is just no.
I would just jump in, Dave, and say that
I think John made the crucial point that the link here is incentives. You have to link, and so that's what I meant. There's three big pieces you got to link, and the linchpin is incentives. But I would say there's a great deal more, I would call it ferment, in the professional societies and some of the leadership of the medical profession out there, because they see they're not stupid people. After all, they never made a B in their whole lives. They do read the paper, and they know that America's economy is under strain. And they know that, in fact, this healthcare cost problem is a serious contributor to international competitive difficulties. And they're worried about, frankly, price controls being imposed upon them. And they are, indeed. Look, go to MedPAC and listen to Nick Walter from the Billings Clinic and some other physician leaders like that. And what you'll see is a lot of them are hungry for opportunity. The problem, Dave, is they can't get government under the current administration to cooperate with payment experience that actually work. There were a lot of great ideas in the MMA, but apparently, by people who are docs and know this more than I do, we didn't execute them very well. I think the next round will be far more.
My only point I would add is that there are some things that are advertised as saving money, may not save money, but may make people healthier. Seems like we should do those even if they don't save money. Saying they don't save money doesn't mean you shouldn't do them.
If they don't save money, they probably cost.
Question here?
The Aging Committee, in terms of an organizational structure, how about FEHB for all rather than Medicare for all? Can you just comment on that?
But the question was, what about the Federal Employee Health Plan as a model, as a benefit for all, meaning that there would be competing private plans that presumably you could choose from and get some subsidy, as opposed to Medicare, which, despite some attempts, is still largely a government-run plan?
I would say your question raises 2 points. One, let's go back to Joe's initial critique, and that is, what is this public plan that the Democrats are advocating that would compete with private plans for the business of all Americans? If it's Medicare, then I share Joe's concern about its relative monopsony power, and first of all, the insurers would never accept it, we'd never get a bipartisan agreement on that, so yada, yada, yada. But state employee plans, which are organized essentially like FEHBP but on a state level, they typically have a self-insured product. It's typically a legacy Blue Cross Blue Shield product. Self-insured for the state means it's ultimately a public plan. The state bears the risk of the insured population. It competes with private commercial HMO type products in a more or less fair marketplace in virtually every state. To me, that is the model. FEHBP could be an umbrella through which you do that, and that might be a way to meld public plan competition with the absence of monopsony power that would go with private plan competition.
Yeah, obviously we're now straying way away from any of the candidates.
Oh, we're in the
right.
truth.
Yeah, we're into the truth. Yeah. But it'll pass.
The reporters are supposed to be the cynical ones, right? First you take all the jokes, and now you want the citizens. There won't be anything left.
I told you we're old.
Okay, I'm going to say something about tents in a minute. The idea of organizing a market makes a lot of sense, but does it have to be FEHB? I mean, the problem with that is the political overtones, not the essential idea. However, when people say that, they also imagine two other things, which I don't think will work. One is benefit standards that are so high that almost nobody could afford them, other than your congressman. And by the way, people tend to forget FEHB, it's an employer-sponsored plan, whereas what we're really talking about is helping people who don't have insurance and often do not have jobs get insurance. So we have this issue, that kind of regulation, which raises costs and especially the image that everybody's going to have a plan that is somehow the minimally acceptable in this country, which frankly is way too high. We're paying too much, we're buying too much, we don't know what we're doing. So we need to really think about other kinds of reforms when we're doing this. Massachusetts didn't do it, and they will eventually pay for it after the rest of us taxpayers pay for it too.
I think that if you're going to require to have people to have coverage, you're going to have to do something to make sure that that coverage is available to them and in a form that they can understand. Small businesses find buying insurance extremely complicated right now. We've got a former partner who went off on his own, and he is just bewildered. This is a healthcare expert, and he's bewildered about all these things. These organizations have been called HIPECs, alliances, help agencies, connectors, and exchanges. And I think there's some other names that I'm missing there. They keep coming up, but then they become unpopular. The plan becomes unpopular. I started working in one state. He said, yeah, we're interested in Massachusetts. I come back the next time, says, don't say the word Massachusetts, don't say connector, because we're not, you know, that carries poor connotation now. But I do think that if you are going to require people to have insurance or expand in the degree to which you rely on individual coverage, you do have to have organizations that will help people sort through the choices.
Marty Sullivan, tax analyst. In Massachusetts, if you do not comply with the individual mandate, you face a tax penalty collected by the Massachusetts Department of Revenue. If these democratic individual mandates come into being, will the IRS play a role in enforcing healthcare policy?
Yes.
I hope so, otherwise it's 101st Airborne. But I would say two things. Remember, most of us have insurance now. And Obama's right about this. Most people do want it. The people you're going to have to enforce it on are the people who are what I call young and immortal. You know, the 26-year-old or the 22-year-old. I can't tell you how many health policy people have bought their newly graduated BAs health insurance because they couldn't bear to live with their child being uninsured, but their child said, Dad, it ain't worth the money, I ain't doing it now. So there are a lot of people out there who do that, that's correct. And they do indeed use care, even though it's a low probability event, they show up. A colleague of mine sitting about 3 rows behind you, Sarah Axine, computed, you know, about 20% of the uncompensated care goes to people who make a lot of money and don't buy health insurance by choice. Those are the ones you're going to have to enforce. For the ones who make a lot of money and don't buy by choice, the tax system is the perfect way to get at them. Now, in the Massachusetts particular case, the penalty in year 1 is something like $300. So I could buy a $3,000 policy, or I could buy a $300. What am I going to do? Well, you know, that was what you'd call a politician being too gentle early on. It's going to have to be a real penalty. But yes, the tax system will be important. But for most of us, we'll buy it now, we're going to buy it then. For most of the uninsured, if you subsidize them appropriately and make it accessible through a marketplace that works, it's not going to be a problem. So I think, in fact, the enforcement problem will be on a relatively small population. Now, I can tell you there will be people in trees in Idaho and Arkansas, where I grew up, that will never do it. And Joe's right, we won't get to universal. Universal is a dream, but I will say we can get damn close if we do it smart.
I would just add that the bigger penalty for buying insurance is the premium. So, you know, it's actually this year, I think Massachusetts charges up to $975, but it varies. But you know, the cost of insurance in Massachusetts is certainly over $3,000 a year. So that's the bigger hurdle. That's the bigger financial penalty.
You mean, I'm sorry, I don't understand.
If you're forced to buy insurance, you have to pay the premium.
Oh, yeah, premium costs more.
Premium costs more. So, I mean, enforcement is a very, very difficult thing when you're talking about low-income people.
Which is why you would only have a system that would give them subsidies and would draw them to the nectar, if you will. And you could also do automatic enrollment. There's lots of ways to make it.
They're in the middle between very rich and very poor.
And those are the guys who are legitimately, and that's why Joe has a point, as usual, you don't want to mandate those guys. Anybody you're not going to subsidize, you don't want to make them buy a Cadillac plane. You want to make them buy what I would call a parsimonious plane. Now, I will say, you got to give the poor a real plan, otherwise you don't get any benefit from calling it coverage but not really giving it coverage. And by the way, we can afford to give the poor a real package, but it's stupid to mandate a Cadillac plan for everybody, and you got to subsidize such high of the income scale it would actually cause me to have to raise Joe's taxes, which is, of course, the thing I don't really want to do.
I'd just add that the IRS could be our friends here. I know it's a little difficult to imagine, but think about those people in the middle. Those individuals, if we're going to, even if it's voluntary, we're going to have to provide them with subsidies so that they can get their coverage. The IRS, or through the tax system, is probably the most efficient way for doing that, delivering the subsidies. Do you really want people in that middle group going down to the Medicaid office every 6 months to prove they're poor so they can get help paying for their insurance? If you're going to expand coverage, whether it be a mandate or voluntary, that kind of a situation, I think, is untenable. It's going to be worse than going down to the DMV to re-register your car every 6 months. It's not going to be fun. So the IRS is our friend in terms of administering the subsidies anyway. The best, cheapest way to do it. I mean, having people go downtown and sit down, it's about $170 per income, per family to process their income eligibility. We're not going to be able to live with that. We're going to have something simple.
So then we got to be careful not to take 3/4 of the people off the tax rolls so they don't file tax returns. One more question, Pete Davis in the back.
Thank you. 2 years ago, when my stepdaughter entered med school, it was against the advice of every doc she knew. Do we face a labor problem in healthcare, and what do these presidential proposals do about it?
Yes and nothing. I would say that yes, and we do, and your advice of your peers and colleagues to your daughter is indicative of what I was talking about in terms of physicians have figured out the current trajectory is unsustainable, and they can't recommend it to their children. It's going all over. The solution, of course, is to enable the practice of medicine to be far more rewarding than it is now, rewarding in lots of ways other than just money. In fact, you probably know, we don't actually enable primary care docs to earn a decent living. I mean, most of them now are making between 130 and 150. That doesn't sound like much, but when you add in malpractice and all those hours and yada, yada, yada. I was going to say, and then the debt is really the big thing. So the creative things, and I do not believe any of the candidates are saying this, but obviously the policy people will talk to them after November and will whisper in their ear. Debt forgiveness for primary care is almost a no-brainer, and a lot of people are coming around to that. More fundamentally, though, I'm back to my linchpin of the reform, payment, realigning incentives. The reason the specialists make so much is because they get paid for doing more stuff. There are 10,000 CPT codes. You know who invents CPT codes? The AMA. You do the math. Okay? That's really stupid to give the guild that is in favor of making more money for docs the right to create a new procedure. They make them by the hour. So what you want to do is stop paying for procedures and pay for keeping people healthy, and then we can incent primary care.
If you want to weigh in?
Yeah, people tend to forget that production functions are not somehow fixed in concrete. The nice thing about a market economy is that when you have a relative scarcity in an input, that the production function tends to change. And so I think the only thing that any of the candidates have said about this at all is McCain pointing out that we could go to, in essence, a different form of health production. We can go to these sort of minute clinics that are out in the stores to take care of the routine things. I mean, his angle is get people out of the emergency rooms, which is a good angle. But think more broadly. Do we really need as many doctors as the AMA says we'll need in 10 years, or would we like a different mix of the health labor force? I mean, we've upgraded the system's upgraded what nurses do, so that now we actually give credit for nurses to actually being able to think. Well, we can continue in that process.
I think it's possible for us to have a system where doctors continue to make a pretty good living, a very good living, while still keeping programs within cost constraints. And I think that means you have to change the incentives. Changes in incentives don't necessarily mean that the providers are going to lose money. It just means that they're going to have to be much smarter about when they do and do not use these services. Many of the things that physicians' income is really a pretty small portion of the total cost. A lot of it's tests, procedures performed in the hospital. With the correction of incentives, you could probably do a great deal to control that growth and at the same time preserve the ability for them doctors to make a decent living. I don't think that's an unsolvable problem at all.
I want to thank the panelists for a particularly well-conceived program, and thank you all for your attention. I'm going to turn it over to we're going to take a break, right? And then, well, hold on, announcement from the sponsor.
We're going to synchronize our watches. We'll start again at quarter of, so that'd be 10:45. And for all of you, take as much of the food as possible. All the interns.
I'm Rudy Penner, and I had this black eye even before the discussion began. I'm a little worried about what might happen afterward. One would think, looking at the big picture, that with the alternative minimum tax causing so many problems and the imminent ending, at least legally, of the Bush tax cuts, that this would be a propitious time for tax reform. So I'm hoping that our panel tells us first how to get there and then what there is. So the first speaker is Alice Brill.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott, for having this and for organizing the New American Foundation, for everybody up here for putting this together. The topics today, I think, are really all three are critical. I would hope that if there had been time for a fourth one, maybe we would be talking about trade policy as well. But these issues are really central to the economic policies that the candidates are working on and talking about. What's nice, I think, about this opportunity is that we have 30 minutes roughly to talk about issues instead of 30 seconds, and we have the opportunities to move away from the sound bites that the campaign, that the candidates are constrained by, to have a little bit more of a substantive discussion about energy policy, healthcare policy, and now tax policy. Make a couple of caveats and then a couple of observations. When we look at the tax policies that are being proposed by the candidates, it's important to keep in mind that these are campaigns and that these are not legislative formulated proposals. And I look out in the room, a lot of people that I recognize are true experts in a lot of these issues, and it's tempting to bury down into the weeds of a lot of these proposals, when we have to keep in mind that there are also proposals that the candidates can get their hands around in that soundbite, and that the voters can get their hands around. And I think that we don't want to use too fine a comb when we start to dissect them. And for one, a lot of times we find that really the meat's not on the bones. But second, it's important to remember that the next president is only the president, and that any of these changes have to come through Congress. And that it's there where a lot of the things can change. That means that a lot of these proposals will never see the light of day. It means a lot of these proposals that do get considered will change significantly. And we just need to look back over the last two terms and at the president's budgets during those since 2001. There are lots of proposals that have never had a hearing, have never gone through committee, never been marked up. And there are lots of proposals that have been enacted, but not in any sense as they were proposed. And the third caveat is that we're at a transition period right now as we go from the primaries to the general. And the way in which the campaigns are looking at the issues, the detail with which the campaigns are looking at the issues is in flux. And the competition, the competitors that the candidates are facing is changing as well. And that's all affecting both what they talk about, how they talk about it, and the timing of what they talk about. Let me just say a little bit next about the landscape. One thing that makes tax policy, I think, different than say, energy or healthcare is this natural-born cliff that the next president is going to face, the next Congress and the next president are going to face. December 31st, 2010 will be, under current law, the end of the Bush tax cuts, most of the Bush tax cuts. That cliff, or that wall, depending on your perspective, is one of the largest pending changes in the tax code, probably the largest pending change in the tax code we've ever faced. For sort of the typical four-person family earning $40,000 a year, they're looking at a tax change of about $2,000. In percent terms, it's probably approaching infinite. Those people are currently off the tax rolls and they're coming back on in a big way. When you aggregate all the policies that are scheduled to come back to the pre-2001 law, we're looking at a change of about $250 billion a year. So it's important to keep that as a perspective as we look at various credits or deductions or new tax ideas that are being put forward by the candidates. This is relative to a $250 billion problem or opportunity that we're facing at the midpoint of the next president's administration. And how we deal with that issue, whether that's taken on as an opportunity or a challenge, is really going to motivate, in my opinion, a lot of the other changes. So while we've seen lots of proposals come forward, I think Senator Clinton probably has the most individual tax policies. None of them really are as significant as what's baked in the cake already. And the timing of those changes, in addition to the, as was just noted, the AMT, which is coming, which is just a larger and larger issue every year. Add on top of that the general budget constraints that are going to really start to bite, and the pay-go concepts that the Democrats are advocating for. There's tremendous pressure in this area. Furthermore, issues such as health care and energy policy are tax policy issues as well. And whether we're talking about things that someone else might describe as a tax holiday being a gimmick, say the gas tax, or more fundamental changes in healthcare using credits to get people insured. Tax policy is a tool and an opportunity for addressing those issues as well. The candidates have come, I think, from a lot of different perspectives on tax policy. As I noted a minute ago, Senator Clinton has really proposed an enormous number of policies. She has a long-term care credit, a dependent care credit, a caregiver credit, a increased deduction for elderly. So sort of group by group by group, we see her put together a series of credits and deductions. Senator McCain has, I think, fewer proposals, but larger proposals. So doubling the standard exemption from $3,500 to $7,000 is going to pick up a lot of tax relief in a lot of categories that are picked up piece by piece by the Democrat candidates, and then some, I imagine. A lot of these issues are really campaign strategy driven more than tax policy driven. But I think that one of the important things to keep in mind is what's missing from a lot of the debate. There certainly are candidates who are talking about raising taxes. The Democrats have committed to undoing some of the Bush tax cuts, and it's important to note that the emphasis on some. Many of the policies, in terms of dollars and just by counting policies, that Democrats want to keep. They want to unwind a number of the policies. But going and looking at issues that are truly broadening the tax base is really not part of the debate at all. So in the next 5 years, the US government will expend probably close to $1 trillion, $800 billion to $1 trillion in tax subsidies for housing. The tax subsidies for healthcare are even larger. So these are the untaxed parts of our economy. More fundamental tax reform, if you want to know when it is that we're starting to talk about fundamental tax reform, it's when we start to talk about tackling some of these tax expenditures, and that's not something that we've heard yet. I think that I will conclude just by noting that one of the big differences that I've observed between the candidates, without getting into the nitty-gritty, is on the issue of marginal rates. What we've seen from Senator McCain, the proposal to lower the corporate tax rate from 35% to 25%, is, in my opinion, one of the most significant of policies that have been proposed among all the candidates. That's a policy that is one could debate. It's large dollars, no question, but it will do tremendous good in my opinion, across a large number of issues, from a global perspective, a competitiveness perspective, but also in an incremental perspective domestically. So lowering that marginal rate does a lot to reduce the distortion between debt and equity, reduce the distortion between corporate structures and non-corporate entities, reduce the economic distortions across asset classes, and reduce the effective marginal tax rates and the distortions across asset class categories. that's a very large and significant change. I think it's interesting to note that it's not a proposal that's been attacked very much by the other candidates. So certainly neither Senators Obama nor Clinton have proposed a rate cut. They haven't been leading the charge against it either. And in fact, Senator Kerry in his campaign proposed a small marginal corporate rate cut, and Charlie Rangel, Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, has proposed a corporate marginal tax rate cut. And so I think that's certainly one issue that, to be optimistic, I think has a lot of promise. And the question is what other changes will actually materialize, and whether or not we'll get to broadening the basis and things that are probably less campaign-oriented but more policy-oriented. Thanks.
Thank you very much. This is a great program, and I want to thank the organizers for doing such a good job, and thank you for inviting me. Like Alex, I noticed that there was something missing from the discussion, which is clearly an important issue for this country. I assume at some point you're going to have a session on why some candidates wear a flag pin and others don't. Well, an actual issue that really is important is tax policy. I would say that for reasons that Rudy and Alex outlined, that this is maybe the most important time for tax policy in the United States since World War II, and we needed to come up with a new substantial revenue source to finance the global war. Unfortunately, the candidates' responses suggest that no one really understands this, or at least they're not going to talk about it in public. There are a number of action-forcing events, things that you think would require the next president, whoever that person is, to take tax policy seriously. One is the expiration of the Bush tax cuts. As Alex mentioned, nobody's talking about letting them all expire, but something will probably have to happen, because we're counting on the revenues that are coming from the expiration, but politically that's not feasible, and given the state of the economy, it's probably not economically feasible as well. But simply extending them doesn't seem like an option anyway, regardless of who the president is. The alternative minimum tax, which continues to threaten tens of millions of taxpayers, but who are always rescued from the brink by Congress at the last possible minute, is just terrible tax policy. For one thing, it makes the budget numbers total fiction. We're pretending, when President Bush says that he's going to balance the budget in 2012, he's implicitly assuming that close to 40 million taxpayers will be subject to the AMT, which isn't going to happen. But we need to come up with another source of revenue, and any sensible tax policy shouldn't have anything that looks like the current alternative minimum tax in it. There are enormous short-term budget challenges, and even worse long-term ones. Extending President Bush's tax cuts and fixing the AMT and extending all of the other expiring tax provisions that are perpetually extended, and which is really not plausible to assume they would expire, would increase the deficit by the next decade by $4.6 trillion, including the interest costs, increase the national debt. Over the long term, the budget challenges are even worse for reasons I assume were discussed in the last panel. Healthcare costs continue to grow much faster than the economy, and the baby boomers are retiring. And sometimes people say, well, you're looking 10 years down the road at a deficit to GDP ratio of 2.8%. Maybe that's not a big deal. But the thing is, we've never had a deficit that large. A deficit to GDP ratio. I'm getting the point is that in the early 1980s, when deficit to GDP ratio was higher, the baby boomers were entering their peak earning years, and now they're about to retire, putting enormous demands on the federal government. Now, Herb Stein had a famous law that if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. The only ways to avoid this future budget calamity is to raise taxes, reduce spending, or increase the rate of growth of the economy, or some combination of the three. But doing nothing doesn't seem like a very good option, because eventually that would drive the economy to a standstill, and the long-term budget projections are just really, really scary. If we continue to kick the can down the road, eventually we will drive our economy into the ground, and it might be very hard to recover from that. There are other factors as well. The income tax is a mess. It's widely perceived to be unfair. It's needlessly complicated. The AMT is a poster child for complexity, but certainly not the only element that is complexity. There are concerns about rising economic inequality. By some measures, economic inequality is higher now than it has been at any time since the Great Depression. And whether or not you care about that as an issue, it is a political issue. And you can tell from some of the debate, particularly on the Democratic side, that there's pressure for policies that could really harm the economy over the long run in the name of, and I think these are motivated by growing unease among lower and middle income people about their declining relative economic status. So what the candidates should be doing is proposing to raise enough revenue to pay for government, at least over the long term, simplifying the tax system, getting rid of the AMT, improving equity, and particularly getting people to think that the tax system is treating them fairly, and enhance economic efficiency, because the economy does need to grow. If this rate of growth slows down, all those long-term projections get even worse. What the candidates have actually proposed to do, and Alex touched on this, is Clinton has a long list of targeted tax breaks, many of which would raise administrative issues, all of which would add complexity, and they would cost money. Obama has a slightly longer list, but he's got some big ticket items in it. Both would extend the middle class tax cuts that are expiring in 2010, and they've taken a no new taxes pledge, either $200,000 or $250,000. They won't raise taxes on anybody thinking below that level. That could be a problem, because it might not be feasible to pay for government raising taxes only on a tiny sliver of people at the very top. The Democrats' plans would likely increase the deficits by as much or more than President Bush. Both of the candidates have talked about abiding by PAYGO, but they've been somewhat cagey about exactly what baseline they would apply pay-as-you-go against. They would increase taxes on the rich and cut them on everyone else, at least in the short term. The long-term effects could be much less progressive if the deficits that produce result in sharp cuts in government services that affect everybody, or new broad-based taxes. And there's a lot of pandering, and the pandering is bipartisan. Senator Obama would exempt almost all seniors from tax. Right now, most senior citizens don't pay income tax. And the Obama campaign has apparently identified a serious problem that we haven't pledged enough resources to senior citizens going forward. Now, even if you thought it was a good idea to exempt everyone earning every old person earning under $50,000 from tax, over the long term, we're going to need to raise revenue from that group. And it'd be very hard to turn that off if it were actually enacted. If for 10 years, seniors just assumed that they never had to pay taxes, it would be hard to change that. Mrs. Clinton has a feel your pain tax policy, which I think is an extension of the kinds of policies in the first Clinton administration, which works politically, but ultimately I think it undermines the progressive income tax because it adds more complexity, it makes people perceive the system as unfair. Senator McCain would extend the Bush tax cuts, he would repeal the AMT, he would introduce expensing, lower the corporate rate. Like all the other candidates, he would make the R&E credit permanent, he would double the dependent exemption. His plan has the advantage that I could actually say it in like one sentence on one breath, but it would cost a lot. It would, relative to current law, it would increase the deficit by $6.5 trillion over the first decade. And when it's fully phased in, and Doug Holt-Aiken has criticized that number, saying, well, this is kind of a vision, and we're not talking about doing this all at once. But when it's fully phased in, it would reduce revenues to levels that we collected during the Eisenhower administration. And I don't see that it's feasible to pay for a much larger government and a much older citizenry with revenues at around 16% of GDP. He's talking about a radical reduction in government, and even, I believe he's sincere in wanting to do that, but politically it just doesn't seem plausible. One way he could balance the budget under his plan would be to eliminate all discretionary spending. It's not going to happen. The proposals would cut rates and move corporate tax towards a consumption tax. That might improve the economy, but it depends on how the deficits are closed. When CBO has looked at lower tax rates, they said, well, they would be good for the economy if the deficit's closed by the equivalent of across-the-board taxes or lump sum taxes. If the deficits are closed ultimately by higher tax rates, that makes things worse than if we hadn't done anything in the first place. Senator McCain, joined now by Senator Clinton, I think wins the prize for pandering. He proposed a gas tax holiday during the summer. Now the fact that he actually won't be president during the summer doesn't restrain him in this. But it's an incredibly stupid idea on many levels, but the most basic one is it can't work. Gasoline is in very short supply, or the supply barely meets demand during the summer. That's why prices always go up. And if he eliminates the gas tax, the price is just going to go up to offset it, because there aren't more sources of refined gasoline in the short run. There are not very many. So, bottom line, this is a critical juncture for tax policy. The candidates aren't proposing serious solutions. We need tax reform. We need a new source of revenue. I agree with Alex that we should lower marginal tax rates and broaden the base. And I think we could do that in a way that's progressive. Michael Gratz has a proposal that would do that. I have a proposal I'll be talking about at a congressional hearing in a couple of weeks to do that. But we can't ignore the obvious fiscal realities, and we really do need to fix the tax system. Now, that might not be something that's feasible to talk about during campaign season, so I would like to suggest another pledge for the candidates, a no new tax policy pledge. Because every time they open their mouths, they say something stupid.
Thanks, Rudy. And for those of you who are following the program at home, I'm supposed to be Bob Carroll. And I'm channeling Bob right now, who's at home suffering from the flu. So I apologize for Bob's absence, and I'll just have to pick up and take on from there. But I'll agree with my colleagues here that this is a tremendously unfortunate missed opportunity for both sides not to take up the mantle of fundamental tax reform. And I think that this is an excellent time where we could possibly reach some bipartisan agreement on fundamental tax reform. After all, you have this unique collision of two major tax policies. Obviously the growth in AMT, as Len has talked about, but also the expiration of the Bush tax cuts. Both parties have something to gain from coming together and trying to solve these two dilemmas. In my mind, AMT is somewhat of a blue state problem. The largest concentration of folks hit by the AMT are in blue states, blue districts, so it is a Democratic problem. On the other hand, certainly, Republicans have great loyalty to the Bush tax cuts and would want to extend them. So it seems to me that both sides could come together and find something in their collective or joint benefit for extending or for finding a fundamental tax solution to that. But unfortunately, all of the candidates seem to be in one way or another moving away from fundamental tax reform, or if nothing else, riddling the code or sticking the code with so many more credits, deductions, and so forth, that is going to make fundamental tax reform even more difficult. And we're already stressing the tax code far too much in my mind. The IRS simply cannot function in administering the tax system. We are asking the IRS to be an extension of the welfare state, EPA, housing, you name it. I mean, we are asking the tax code to subsidize our housing, to adopt children, to put the children in daycare, to take care of grandma, to buy a hybrid vehicle, to put a solar panel on your roof once you've bought it through the subsidization in the tax system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of the candidates are then adding to that morass with a whole other series of their own types of tax credits, whether it's college credits, savings credits, and so forth. And all of the tax plans are running into reality, an unspoken reality about the various demographic and other changes that are happening with the American taxpayer. First and foremost, over the last 8 years or so, we have knocked millions of people off the tax rolls through the expansion of various credits and deductions. In 2000, there were roughly 30 million Americans who paid no income taxes once they took advantage of their credits and deductions. That number is now about 43, 44 million non-payers because of the generosity of things like the child credit, the EITC, and so forth. Add to that another 15 million or so who don't earn enough to file, and we're now looking at a huge swath of America who is disconnected from the tax system. Interestingly enough, all of the candidates are promising more tax relief for people who don't pay taxes. So it's like pushing on the string. John McCain just talked about a $5,000 health care credit if the people who don't have health care don't pay enough in tax to use that credit. So it's, again, it's like pushing on the string. Now, the only other way you can give those people tax relief is through a refundable credit. Well, we're already dishing out $50 billion a year in refundable credits. So once again, we're asking the IRS to be sort of an ATM machine for social benefits, something that we ought to be very, very cautious in asking it to do. We're also, I think, coming up against other demographic shifts. The aging of America is one. We have the baby boomers reaching their peak earnings potential when just obviously they're going to start retiring. Well, the first of them already has started to retire. But that presents some interesting challenges as well. Senator Obama has talked about taking, as Len mentioned, taking all seniors off the tax rolls. But on the other hand, he's going to raise taxes on them by increasing the tax rates on capital gains and dividends. And who is the largest beneficiary of capital gains and dividends? Seniors. So that reality hasn't quite sunk in. All the candidates want to reach the middle class. Well, you know, when we've done surveys, 80% of Americans think they're in the middle class. So that's always a popular thing to do. But the reality is very different. Our data shows that the simple fact is only about 15% of all personal income taxes are paid by the bottom 80% of taxpayers. So we're getting to a point where there is so little income left at the bottom of the tax system or the bottom of the income scale in order to give tax relief against. So where do we go? Well, we're going to start kicking more and more people off the rolls. The rich are going to pay an even greater share. So anything you do with the tax system is going to be tax cuts for the rich because, quite frankly, they are paying all the taxes. And let me just finish up by hitting on a point that Alex started to talk about, and that is the U.S. corporate tax rate and competitiveness. And this is something I think that is one of the perhaps the most glaring absences from this entire debate. The U.S. is falling further and further behind in the global tax competition. Last year alone, 27 countries across the globe cut their corporate tax rate. This year, in the last 6 weeks or so, about 5 or 6 major countries have announced cuts in their corporate tax rate. Korea being one, Taiwan another, Hong Kong another, South Africa. And the average corporate tax rate across the OECD is now somewhere around 26%. The U.S. corporate tax rate, when you add the federal and the state, is about over 39%. We're second highest overall corporate tax rate only to Japan. And many states even have higher tax rates than that because of their state level. So by standing still, we are falling further and further behind in the corporate tax rate. And only McCain has talked about reducing the corporate rate, and unfortunately, he's not emphasized it enough in terms of what it would do for American competitiveness. And I think that his plan is actually a bit tepid for what's really needed to bring the U.S. in line with our global competitors. As I said, the average OECD rate is around 26%. We really need a federal corporate tax rate of about 20% in order to be competitive with the rest of the globe when you add in the state and local. So again, I'll just wrap up and say this is a huge missed opportunity. There's, as my colleagues have pointed out, tremendous pandering on both sides, and unfortunately all of those, that type of pandering moves us further and further away of the ultimate goal of fundamental tax reform, a simple tax system, and one that not only we can comply with, but the IRS can actually administer.
Well, thank you very much. That was a pretty depressing session, I have to say. I guess Alex hit the only optimistic note, which was that the Congress won't enact any of this stuff anyway. So let's take your questions. Yes? Here it comes.
Does anyone think it's time for a value?
Can you introduce yourself?
Does anyone think it's time for a value-added tax?
Peter, can you introduce yourself?
Peter Heller, Johns Hopkins SICE.
Yeah, I actually think it is. And the concern about the value-added tax Well, the concern on the Democratic side is that it tends to be regressive, that low-income people spend a larger share of their income than higher-income people do. On the conservative side, it's that it could be a money machine. Larry Summers used to joke, although I should point out, I had heard this joke way before he started saying it. He used to joke that when conservatives figure out it's regressive and liberals figure out it's a money machine, they'll have a deal. But what I propose, and this is not an original proposal with me, a number of other people, I think actually Maya has talked about this, is tying a value-added tax to healthcare. And if you actually had something like a voucher that paid for healthcare for everybody, and that was funded by a dedicated value-added tax, then the VAT rate would depend on healthcare spending. And I think that would actually put pressure to keep the VAT rate down lower than it would be otherwise, to keep healthcare spending down lower than it would be otherwise, because every American would see that they were paying higher prices as a result of the VAT. And if you took Medicaid, the federal part, the non-payroll tax part of Medicare, and the tax exclusion out of income tax financing, you could lower income tax rates substantially. So you could sort of do the kind of thing that we did in 1986, where we had another revenue source. In 86, it was corporate tax revenues, which nobody thought they were paying, and use that to pay for income tax cuts on most people, and possibly that could provide the basis for a deal.
Any other comments on that?
Well, I'll relate this to the issue over corporate tax reform. As the Treasury report showed last December, there's a limit to how low you can cut the corporate tax rate simply by broadening the base and by eliminating most of, or if not all of, the various exclusions within the corporate code. You can only bring the rate down to about 29%. In order to be more competitive, as I mentioned, we need to be perhaps in the 20% range or even lower. So how do you make up the difference? Well, perhaps it might be time to start thinking about a value-added tax as a replacement, either entirely for the corporate tax or for a vast portion of it. That's obviously going to cause a great deal of anxiety among many conservatives, because, as Len mentioned, the idea of a VAT is very terrifying. But I think that in terms of, if we start thinking about the positives from increasing U.S. competitiveness, we may have to look to something like that in order to get rid of something like the corporate tax, which is clearly dragging down the U.S. economy.
Alex, want to comment?
I'll just echo, to some extent, Scott and Len. I don't know that it's a VAT that we need per se, but what I do believe is that we need tax revenues, in part because we have an aging population, and we need revenues that are collected more efficiently. So VAT would certainly describe that. It's a tool that could fit that bill. And as Scott noted, it could be used, I guess as both Scott and Len noted, it can be used either to replace an existing stream of revenue or for a targeted and precise purpose. And there is something poisonous about that word VAT with Republicans. It's like a vat of boiling oil or something like that in their mind. But in reality, there are lots of ways to craft something. Just don't call it that, but to craft a policy that's efficiently collecting revenues, more efficiently than the current tax code. And then the question is, what do you use that revenue for? You could use it for healthcare. You could use it to make our tax code more competitive. And as someone on the last panel, I think, joked that we would have impose an energy tax to pay for our healthcare needs. I don't think that's a joke at all. I mean, I think that that's exactly the kind of concepts that we should be thinking about, talking about, that type of creative way of solving problems.
I'm Bruce Bartlett. Len, you said that the gas tax is a stupid idea, and I agree with that, or the holiday. But I disagree with your reasoning. You said that there really wouldn't be any reduction in price, but that suggests that the tax is paid by the oil companies. I don't think anybody believes that the oil companies pay the gasoline excise tax. It's not shifted backwards, it's shifted forward onto consumers. Because if it's true that the price wouldn't change if you lowered the rate, then that means it's not going to change if you raise the rate. So you might as well raise the gasoline tax, because nobody will have to pay it except the oil companies.
Well, there are two things. One is that short-term versus long-term. They're talking about doing this starting in a month. Actually, it's another reason not to take it seriously. Congress doesn't do anything in less than a month.
Tax rebate. 3 days.
Yeah.
That used to be true.
But in the short term, refiners are running pretty close to capacity during the summertime. And there's just not much additional supply in the short term. In the long term, the supply is more responsive. And if you raise, and certainly if you raise, and it's also true that the response is asymmetric. If you raise the tax, refiners could shut down their least productive facilities. But if you lower the tax, they lowered the price, consumers would want to drive more, and there's just not more gas to put on the market. So it's the economics is the supply is pretty inelastic in the short run. In the long run, it's much more elastic.
Because that if it's not in the price effect, then you're going to get some weird behaviors in August as people get in line to buy gas. If the prices are going to move, you're going to start to get lines in August as people try to fill their tanks and fill their water and cans with gasoline.
Yes.
Stephen Mango, I'm a senior policy advisor with Robert Curing United. And I think the two proposals by the Democratic Party, which Hillary and Obama seems to suggest that when you're rich, you're an enemy of the economy. They have proposed all these things, tax policies, health policies, but they never really tell us where it's coming from. And they said that they're not going to increase taxes. But all these policies that are proposed come to healthcare, where are they getting the money from? And really, if you look at it, sincerely, I believe that some people are poor because they are poor. Now, if you're a teenager, you're going to have 10 children, you're going to have, definitely, it's like going to the store and buy poverty. So it seems to suggest that people who have money, they're enemies to the economy. And all these proposals cost huge sums of money. Realistically, you look at it, as a panel, these three economic proposals, be tax or economics or health policy, well, which one is realistic? Can you tell us definitely, because we are not an expert on these things?
Anybody think any of the proposals are realistic?
No. I mean, but they all talk about some sources of revenue. They want to close corporate tax loopholes. Senator McCain talks about pretty dramatic cuts in spending, but the thing specifically he's talked about would not amount to that much money. Getting rid of earmarks is maybe $18 billion a year. Get rid of all of them, and to think that those wouldn't go into some other part of the budget, I think is probably fantasy. They've all talked about lowering healthcare costs, and there's a bipartisan agreement that we should get more quality for the money and we shouldn't pay for ineffective care. I imagine those both produce applause lines, but the details of actually accomplishing that seem to be very difficult.
No one's talked about what I regard as one of the most radical revenue-raising proposals of all, and that is Senator Obama's idea of starting the payroll tax up again above, say, $200,000 or $250,000. A huge increase in marginal rates up there. Does anyone have any comments on that?
No, I think that one of the more amusing debates was between Senators Obama and Clinton the other day in talking about the middle class or trying to define what the middle class meant in their terms. And to one, it was families earning up to $200,000. The other one was up to $250,000. And where I grew up, both of those guys would have, like, a limo and a swimming pool, but that's a whole other thing. But then the issue of Senator Obama saying, well, on the one hand, we're going to protect those people from income taxes, but we're going to raise payroll taxes. And it would be perhaps one of the most dramatic changes in tax policy. And I think one that ought to be looked at extremely carefully in terms of what impact it would have, not only on marginal tax rates, but all the other incentives that go with it. Could it cause, for instance, a shift among higher income people into things like S-corps and other entities in order to avoid the payroll tax, as some do to avoid Medicare taxes? It's something that should be looked at extremely carefully.
should also mention, one other potentially large source of revenue is the cap and trade proposal, which Senator McCain at times has said that he would support. And depending on, so the idea is you auction permits to emit CO2, and depending on how that's done, it could raise an enormous amount of revenue for the government.
Or be given away free.
Yeah.
The gentleman in the white shirt way back there.
Yeah, I think John McCain has also said that raising the capital gains tax, like Obama has said, would affect 100 million Americans. But he said, I think he said families or Americans or households. I was wondering if you could say whether or not that's an accurate figure. And because I know one of you said senior citizens is most affected by raising the capital gains and dividends tax. And I was wondering if you could just expand on that a little.
Well, you may know the numbers better, Scott. I just note that it's important to keep in mind that both the direct effects and the indirect effects of any tax policy, but certainly any policy that's geared at capital accumulation. So the cap gains and dividend tax rates, as you change those, you're changing the tax liabilities for those who have cap gains and dividends in taxable accounts. But you also have a lot of indirect effects. So you have an effect on the value of stocks, which may affect the returns in a 401k, even though 401k accounts aren't paying cap gains and dividends. And then you're having other effects more broadly on the economy. And you're having effects on the amount of investment we have in general, which has an effect on the amount of wages people are earning. So those are some of the really root fundamental tax policy questions. Very different from, say, a tax credit to encourage this behavior or that behavior. But really a tax on the fundamental production in the U.S. economy is really going to be felt across the board.
Len, you've written volumes on capital gains.
I think it's certainly at least misleading. The implication is that everyone who owns a 401k would be affected by a reduction in capital gains and dividends tax rates. And the direct effect, it doesn't have any direct effect on people who hold stock through those vehicles. If you own stock in a 401k, it's taxed, when you take the money out, it's taxed as ordinary income when you retire, or not if it's a Roth IRA. The indirect effect, Alex hinted at the fact that lowering capital gains and dividends rates could increase stock market values, but whether that actually happens is a complicated question, because so much of American corporate stock is held by individuals that aren't affected, or entities that aren't affected by the capital gains tax or the dividends tax, either through 401ks or through nonprofits that aren't taxable, or through foreign investors. So my guess is that it doesn't have very much or even any effect on stock market values. But it's certainly not true that 100 million people pay capital gains taxes. If you look at the actual data, capital gains tax is very, very concentrated among very high-income people. Even though most of the people who pay the tax have relatively modest incomes, the amount of tax they pay is tiny, and it's something like 70 or 80% of the tax is paid by the top 10% of households.
Well, that may be true. There are a vast number of people further down the income scale who do hold stock and rely on it, and many of those people are seniors. We did Tax Foundation released a piece a year or two ago looking at not just the distribution of who claims capital gains and dividends. As Len mentioned, it is dramatically up the income scale, but if you look at who benefits most as a fraction of their income, it does tend to be older Americans. And we see that stock ownership tends to rise with age. And so it is becoming a greater and greater part or importance to older Americans. And with the baby boom, I suspect that this is probably, I don't know this for a fact, one of the largest shareholding cohorts in American history. And I would dare say that we ought to be very careful about knocking the legs out from under their retirement as the baby boom now moves into retirement.
Well, it's time to bring this session to an end. I'd like to thank the panelists very much, and I'm looking for go first.
Okay, thank you, and I should probably specify I'm with Senator Obama. So Rudy and the organizers have suggested that the three of us begin with a broader brush treatment of the economic policies of our candidates. So let me try to do so and leave specifics for your questions. first, I think that the Senator begins with two observations. There are two observations which I think come up just about every time we have any extended economic policy discussion. The first is the impact of the middle class squeeze in both a short-term and a longer-term secular sense on the United States, the profound economic and political consequences of the middle class squeeze, which again includes not just the short-term effects of higher energy prices and housing and the like, but the long-term stagnation in wages and concerns about the availability of good middle-class jobs going into the future. Secondly, and related to that, the shifts in technology, the changes in the world economy obviously pose real challenges to the United States in many ways, some of which you've heard about, I think, in the preceding panels, but they also do provide opportunities. And thus, although I think he's very clear that we can't go on as we have been, certainly not for the last 7 years, we can't return to older times either. And we need to be very clear about that. So a dynamic economy that provides strong, sustained, and shared growth, I think, informs all of his economic policies. The other prefatory point is the process and the need to fix and adjust the political process to ensure that policies that are adopted and implemented in Washington are both dynamic and fair. And this is where, of course, the theme of special interest effects has been pervasive in much of what he's talked about. So having said that, let me try to define or specify 4 areas of economic policies and the aims that those embody for us. First, the need to provide a stable environment for economic growth. Now, obviously, that includes sound fiscal and monetary policies, but in the current circumstances, it's probably worth noting a couple of other things that Senator Obama has touched on. The problems with our financial regulatory system are not just the stuff of the current crisis, although they certainly are that, but also the failure adequately to regulate and structure the financial system has obviously itself had an effect on monetary policy that hasn't yet been understood, obviously has had an impact on the savings versus credit trade-off, and obviously, of course, too, we've had cumulative impacts on external deficits trading current account. And thus, for him, there is an imperative to have more effective financial regulation, as he laid out in his Cooper Union speech a little while back, and also to provide a more sophisticated form of regulation of extensions of credit. A second area of policy is providing relief for the middle class. This is a response to the stagnant wages, the rising price of essentials. The centerpiece of that effort for him is the middle class tax cut, which I'm sure you're at least somewhat familiar with, although I have to note in passing that I noticed some errors in the presentation of our plan on that handout you have, so you may want to go to the Senator's campaign website to see exactly what we do say. This also includes a mortgage credit for non-deductors, that is those who don't file Schedule A with their returns, a higher education tax credit, and of course the health care plan, which serves many purposes, competitiveness among them, but is also something of fundamental importance to the middle class. The third area of economic policy initiative is explicitly future-oriented, is investing in the United States for the good jobs of the future. And this in turn breaks down into a series of policies to promote innovation, a series of policies to prepare our people for the high-skilled jobs of the future, attention to increasing productivity on an economy-wide basis, so as obviously to enhance the individual productivity of American workers. And I would just, again, not wanting to do a laundry list here, but just note that in formulating these policies, what we've tried to do is tie efforts at direct good job creation to other important economic ends, whether they be a more sustainable set of energy policies or improvement in our infrastructure so as I said a moment ago, to enhance productivity more broadly. And then fourth, we need a set of sustainable international economic policies, those that are sustainable both at home and abroad. I know your concerns here today are not principally with international policy, but that is a fourth and important leg of his overall economic policy, and thus that gets internationally to things like the need for China to change its currency practices, and more generally for the fast-growing developing countries to have a more balanced economic growth model that is more domestic demand and not sole reliance or principal reliance on export-led growth. At home, it means changing the trade policies that we have pursued to ensure that these policies are directly benefiting people in the middle class, the creation and maintenance of good jobs in the United States. So let me stop there, and as I say, rather than try to give you a little bit on every policy that we've got, and instead address the specific questions you may have.
Thanks, Rudy. I think that Senator McCain is a person who, if you look at his program and look at the economic policies he's talked about, recognizes that there's a very momentous year in economic policy coming after the next president is elected because of the vagaries of Senate rules, a number of tax reductions that have been passed in the past are set to expire. And there's going to be a time where virtually every corner of the tax code, if you consider that the AMT is being patched every year and so on, is on the table. And the thing that I find most attractive about the senator's approach as we head towards such a moment is that he he believes that the only way that we're going to be able to take all of the challenges, the policy challenges that the next president has, and meet them is if we have a candidate that is willing and able to work collegially with friends on both sides of the aisle. In that regard, it's extremely, I think, impressive if you look at Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Obama's team, at the very large number of reasonable, sensible people like the Austin Goolsbys and Gene Sperlings of the world, that were they to be president would, in the same situation, recognize the same things. And so as we talk about our differences here, I think it's important to stipulate at the beginning that people, well-trained economists on all the teams recognize that there are going to be a lot of variables at play after the next election, and that the only way that bills are actually going to happen, if you go from proposals to laws, is that people work collegially together. And I'd have to say, given the records of all three people who are left in the campaign, although I guess you folks might be getting a little tired of seeing each other every week, that there's great hope for the tax policy community. As far as the senator's own approach, I think that it really hasn't changed since I first met him in the late 90s. And that is that he believes that in order to have efficient taxes, you need to start with a small government, and that he uses earmarks often. Len mentioned them on the last panel as an example, but I think that he's a very common sense kind of conservative who recognizes that if government spends money, then eventually the taxpayers are going to have to pay for that. And so that everything really begins from having very strong fiscal restraint. On the tax side, Going all the way back to his platform in the 2000 campaign, Senator McCain has always been someone who understood, I think, the lessons, the main lessons of tax literature that suggests that when you tax heavily saving and investing, then you undermine growth, and that an optimal tax system would move us in a direction of doing less, or imposing less of an impediment to growth. And so in his platform, there's very strong evidence of attention to this. I would say, in addition, something that really impressed me as an academic economist who never really has thought much about political viability of things. The senators became convinced, I believe, in this election cycle, that one of the main reasons why that there are legitimate problems with the middle class and manufacturing wages keeping up and so on. One of the main reasons why that some of the squeeze data that my friends at the table over there often point to are true, is that the U.S. has become a very unattractive place in tax terms for people to locate their businesses. And I think that this is becoming an increasingly bipartisan acknowledgement. If you look at Senator Kerry in 2004, he proposed a reduction in the corporate rate in his presidential platform. Charlie Rangel's big tax bill that he had last year proposed a reduction as well. And I think one of the centerpieces of Senator McCain's plan is to reduce the corporate rate significantly. His rate reduction, about 10 percentage points, would, while it's a big change, would basically just bring the U.S. back down into the middle of the pack in terms of the countries that we compete with. And I think that when government sets up an impediment, and I know the Senator believes when government sets up an impediment for America's competitiveness, then we shouldn't be surprised when the statistics don't necessarily go our way. On the other issues that the Senator has spoken and taken strong positions on in the campaign, I think that he's very much opposed to the complexity of the AMT, and also to the kind of, I guess, almost charade that we go through each year, where we pretend we pass a budget that we pretend is virtuous, and then sort of ignore the budget by the end of the year and throw patches in for the AMT, and pretend that that's somehow, and do that year after year, and sort of get surprised by the AMT patch at the end of the year, it seems, every year, and don't look at the long run budget costs of AMT repair. And he wants to sort of end the charade and put everything on the table and just repeal the AMT. With regard to the EGTRA and JAGTRA tax cuts, I think that the Senator's position is that that's the current baseline that we should work from. Now, I think that as we look forward to the fall and the convention, one of the things that I expect that we'll see is that there'll be a lot more details around these sketches of policies that as a nominee, Senator McCain will naturally have to provide. And I look forward to receiving them from the Democratic nominee as well, because it's very easy to say, well, I want to lower the corporate tax rate, but to go from that to a bill, of course, you have to fill in a lot of details. And I know that the Senator and his team are working very much on these things right now. But if someone were to ask me, just as a tax analyst on the outside, what does this proposal or that proposal cost, then I couldn't really, in good faith, tell you exactly what this proposal or that proposal costs at this moment, because the details of putting things in legislative language, which you have to do if you're president, are still underway. And the same is true, I could say, for the plans of Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Obama, that very often he can say he's going to cut this tax or that tax, but there's generally, maybe even purposefully, in some cases, in some folks' plans, not the kind of level of detail I need to figure out the score. But I can say as a general principle that if we go back and look at Senator McCain's opposition to President Bush's tax cuts, it was always based on the very strong belief that he has that in the end the numbers have to add up, and that if you want to have low taxes for a long time, then you're going to have small government too, because otherwise the deficits will build up and you're going to end up having to pay for it. And I know that's kind of the Ur principle of John McCain's economics, that the government has to pay for itself. And I will expect that as we move forward and watch the agenda proceed, that's going to be a motivating factor as the proposals go from campaign rhetoric to legislative language. I think that the difference between Senator McCain and his two opponents, I think that the big one that I see is that Senator McCain is much more wary of big marginal tax rate increases, worried that there are negative economic effects of those. So I don't think that, for example, Senator McCain would likely ever propose increase in the marginal tax rate up to, by my calculations, Senator Obama has the tax rate on labor income at the top up to about 52%. If you include the rolling back the Bush tax cuts, bringing back the phase outs of the itemized deductions and so on, and then taking off the cap of the payroll tax. So the big picture difference, I believe, is that Senator McCain has a belief that marginal tax rates matter, that tax policy affects the efficiency and competitiveness of the economy, and is wary of high tax rates, and I think aggressive, will be aggressive as president in doing what it takes to make sure that taxes can stay low. And so with that, thank you.
Well, thank you. And I'll try to be brief as well. I think that Senator Clinton's perspective on the economy is informed by the real variety of experiences that she's had over the course of her career, growing up in the Midwest, living in the South, and as a senator now from New York, representing both the financial center of the world with businesses that have grown and succeeded enormously in the global economy, and representing upstate New York, which is a rural agriculture and manufacturing based economy that has faced many of the struggles and also some of the successes that we have seen across the country. I think that her view of the current economic environment is there's a lot of similarities to the landscape that Dan outlined, and so I just mentioned just very briefly. I think that she's quite concerned about the current changes in the economy and whether our economic policy framework is actually working to encourage shared growth or impeding it. I think that over the past several years, the stagnation in wages, which we often talk about, and the statistic that wages have fallen almost $1,000 since 2000 gets bandied around a lot, but for people who Senator Clinton is meeting with and spending time with on the campaign trail, that statistic is a really hard reality of their life. And I've been looking more at Indiana recently for reasons that should be obvious, and I had to go back and check the data 2 or 3 times to see that in Indiana that statistic is over $4,000. The typical family has seen income fall over $4,000, and that's obviously affected by the decline in the manufacturing base. But nonetheless, the stagnation in wages during a period where we have seen record increases in corporate profit and a divergence in the income spectrum is something that is quite concerning to Senator Clinton, particularly in the context of an economic policy that, from her perspective, has not sought to address the new challenges and work to address that squeeze that is facing middle-class families. So over the course of the campaign, she has sought to lay out components of her vision of how she would move economic policy in a new direction. She also, one of the other virtues, in addition to the variety of experiences she has, is she's also truly a policy wonk and is very focused on offering specific ideas, talking to as many people as she can, and really trying to present what specifically she would do. And so I won't go through any or all of our plans in explicit detail because it would bore all of you to death. But let me just mention 4 quick themes which I think underlie her approach to economic policy. The first is her view that we need to have proactive and pragmatic executive leadership that is willing to act to address problems before they become crises and restore a sense of economic confidence. I think that one of the unique things about this election is that it's the first time in several decades that we're running. We could debate this, but by all appearances, we appear to be running during a recession, or at least during a period of market slowdown. And I think that Senator Clinton's approach in the campaign is reflective of the way that she would approach the presidency, which is to seek to identify problems and speak out and try to make clear that she would be addressing them in sensible, proactive ways before they spiral out of control. I think the housing crisis is the best example, where she, for over a year now, has been speaking very vocally about the need to be more proactive about addressing both the regulatory failures that led to a lot of the abuse and the excesses in the housing market, and also take steps to ensure that both at the individual and the neighborhood level and at the national level, that the crisis stayed contained and didn't cause unnecessary harm. Unfortunately, I don't think that we have not seen the responses that were commensurate with the type of specific action she's been calling for, and I think that as a result, we are experiencing some of that excess and unnecessary harm from the fallout from the housing crisis that I think would have and could have been partially prevented had we taken some of the steps that she has talked about, and so I think that that's. But I think that her approach in that area is indicative of the way that she would lead as president. A second is directly addressing over the longer term the squeeze that middle-class families are facing. And I think the best way to think about Senator Clinton's approach here is she looks at this question about how can we not have a knee-jerk response to look for new ways that government can be involved, nor have a completely hands-off approach, but instead, what are the ways in which government can act to help empower families, empower people to achieve their own economic interests and their own economic goals, and provide more support in an environment where middle-class families really are facing unique stress. And so I think if you look at her approach to healthcare and encouraging more savings and investment and wealth creation among families, as well as taking steps to increase the affordability and the accessibility of higher education. In each area, we can get into some of the specifics, but in general, the design of the programs that she's talked about is really based on how can we give the tools and support to families so that they can make the choices that they want to and have more ability to make the choices that they want to going forward. The third area is addressing the longer term question of how do we actually increase the attractiveness of the United States as as an economy to locate new job production, new job creation, and how do we ensure that we remain at the cutting edge and we actually create and maintain good jobs here in the United States. You know, I think one of the most interesting and challenging questions that Senator Clinton gets on the campaign trail, and it comes again and again from the families and the workers at her events, is where are the new jobs going to come from in the next decade, in the next generation? What is going to be the driver that ensures that there are jobs for that can provide the kind of wages and benefits that can sustain a decent middle class lifestyle? And it is a challenging question, and I think poses a challenge to all of us and to the next president. And she has sought over the course of the campaign to try to address it through a number of different proposals. Let me just mention one very quickly, because I do think this question of corporate tax reform is one that you had talked about earlier. You know, Senator Clinton's view is that we absolutely can do better, and we should look seriously at corporate tax reform. She recently, in a speech a couple weeks ago, laid out a proposal to reform the tax code by ending provisions within the corporate tax code that provide a tax incentive to locate and maintain profits abroad, and use those resources instead to enact the largest increase in the R&D tax credit in a generation. Not just make it permanent, but really strengthen that credit because it's shown to be effective, but we have fallen behind as other countries have increased their efforts to encourage research and development investment in their countries. We've fallen from having the strongest tax incentive for research and development in the late 1980s to being 17th in the world now. So her proposal seeks to change that and to provide a new and really strong incentive to invest in research, and particularly in research wages here in the United States, which would help drive both innovation and further job creation. And then on the last point, on this question of restoring fiscal responsibility, I think that it's one of the things that I think frustrates Senator Clinton the most about the recent period is the abdication of fiscal responsibility in Washington, and the dramatic move that we've seen from a projected $5.6 trillion 10-year surplus at the beginning of 2001 to our current situation where, given the stimulus, and we're likely to see $400 billion deficit, but we have ongoing deficits into the future. Frustrating from her perspective because it was avoidable and was in part due to policy choices that she disagreed with. Going forward, she feels like it's very, very important. Kevin's point is well taken, that none of us in the campaign context are drafting legislation, and so there's always some room for more details down the road. On the other hand, she has felt a real responsibility throughout this campaign. I refer to it as the Jerry Maguire principle, which is you got to show me the money. You have to, if you're going to propose a new tax program, a new tax cut, a new tax incentive, or a new spending program, you have to be clear with voters and with analysts how you are going to finance that. And I think that if we can get into the details, but I think that at a high level, that Senator Clinton has been very specific and conservative in relying on savings that that is scorable or judged by independent experts to be likely to materialize, and as a result has put forward an agenda where she can say with credibility and confidence, you can look at the numbers that I put forward and say that I am proposing to pay for all of the new, again, tax and investment initiatives that I put forward as a part of this campaign. And for her, that's a very important principle to underlie her entire economic platform. So I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'll go directly to audience questions. If any of you have points you want to make about other presentations, you can work them into your answers regardless of the question. Over here.
Marty Sullivan with Tax Analysts. Simple question for each member of the panel. Is your candidate in favor of retaining the pay-as-you-go budget rules?
Kevin?
I haven't spoken with the senator about that, so I do not know. I apologize, but I can find out for you.
I have. He is.
I have as well, and she is.
That was easy. Yes?
Hi, Bob Wegner with nationaleconomist.com. The question again is for all three of you. Does your candidate believe that inflation is the greatest threat to the economy in the next couple of years? And what policies what policies would your candidate implement now to fight inflation, if they believe any need to be implemented?
Why don't we start over here this time?
There's no question that Senator Clinton is quite concerned about.
Does she think it's the greatest? It can be yes or no.
I mean, I actually think that from her perspective as a candidate and looking at the various challenges, it's not actually as simple an answer as yes or no. I think that she is deeply concerned about it. She's concerned about the impact of high oil prices that are resonating through the economy and impacting typical families in a whole range of different ways. And she is focused on how can we address that both in a very short-term sense and also whether there are ways that we can address that in the long term. Over the long term, she's incredibly committed, both when you look at her healthcare plan and also her broad approach to energy and reducing our dependence on foreign oil and also reducing the carbon intensity of our economy. That in both those areas, both health inflation and oil prices are something that she's very focused on in terms of her approach and her economic agenda. So again, what I would say is that she's very concerned about inflation. She's also concerned about the fact that the economy, from everything that everyone she has talked to and all of the data that she's consulted, is already in a recession, and we need to be ready to take steps to address the fallout from that and make sure that we keep the recession as short and as shallow as possible. And she's also, outlined steps that she thinks she needs to take in that respect as well.
Well, obviously, inflation cuts to the heart of middle-class standards of living, and thus is directly related to Senator Obama's principal concerns, which I mentioned a moment ago. In terms of the present, I think what we're looking at now, whether you're sitting over on Constitution Avenue today and tomorrow trying to decide what to do with interest rates, or whether you're an independent economist trying to project what's going to happen over the next 4 to 6 quarters, that there is a there are two sets of expectations. I think one set of expectations is that there are some structural forces in the economy right now pushing towards higher inflation. Brian's already mentioned some of the most salient. A second is that there is, I think, a fairly widespread expectation that as the effect of the slow growth, really recession, begins to take hold, that you will probably see some degree of moderation in the underlying inflationary forces. But we're probably going to be facing them going into the future. And so if you identify what those are, and what you identify is a set of fiscal imbalances and some exogenous inflationary forces such as high energy prices, then one needs to attack those going forward. There aren't short-term fixes for structural problems, whether the structural problems are fiscal, inflationary, or otherwise.
Yeah, very briefly, the senator recognizes, as I guess would any analyst who looked at the data, that one of the main reasons why the middle class has been having trouble keeping up lately is that there have been negative shocks on inflation, or positive if you want to say it's been higher than we thought, negative if you want to say it's bad news. When inflation surprises on the upside, it runs ahead of wage agreements, drives real wages down, and harms welfare, especially of typical workers. And so, I don't know if we had a contest to say what's the biggest problem right now, but I don't know that the senator has said, this is the biggest. I'm certainly not aware of him saying that, but it's a big problem. It's a big problem, and it's also in terms of international relations. I think as we go forward in this year, it's going to be a bigger and bigger problem and more in the news. The high food prices have caused riots in about 10 countries now. There are real political and economic pressures that are rising right now because inflation is so high. As you know, I agree with the other panelists that from the point of view of fiscal policy, the levers that the president controls, there are important things you can do in the long run to try to address price increases. But in the short run, really, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. And Senator McCain regularly speaks about his respect for the independence of the Fed and so on. And so I think he supports the Fed's attempt to help us through the recession.
12.5% annualized money growth is he comfortable with that rate?
Yeah, I'm sure he would comment on monetary policy. It's his role to respect the independence of the Fed.
Yes.
Rod Coloring, the Asian American Chamber. For the panelists, your candidate's opinion on alternative investments and hedge funds in particular.
Sorry, could you, what alternative investments in hedge funds?
Hedge funds in particular.
What, from a regulatory point of view, or from what point of view?
I think just in general, are they good, neutral, bad? Is that something that you all might have an opinion on?
I think the question is a little underspecified, which is I think what Rudy was suggesting. If you're asking for a regulatory question as opposed to, I guess from a candidate's point of view, that would be a regulatory question. And what Senator Obama has said with respect to the financial system more generally is the two salient things here. One is a need for adequate transparency within the system. I think one thing we learned from the events of last year was that there was inadequate transparency in many arenas. Secondly, the need to look at systemic risk as opposed to only looking at risk associated with a particular financial institution. The way right now that our financial regulatory structure has developed is whether you're talking about a commercial bank or a mutual fund or a investment bank, the forms of regulation, whether it's capital regulation or restrictions on activities or anything else, that exist are in a kind of bottom-up fashion that only looks at the particular institution. Each of the significant financial market events of the last 15 or 20 years has had its origins unexpectedly in the intersection of developments among financial institutions and financial sectors. And that is why he proposed, as part of his financial regulatory plan, an independent look at systemic risks, explicitly mandating or explicitly charging a group with looking at how risks pass between different actors in the financial systems, which would include, but by no means be limited to, hedge funds.
Kevin, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's a very general question, but I think that the senator often speaks of the remarkable world that we live in, where innovation is happening all the time, and financial innovation as well. I think that he has great respect for the people who innovate in that world and provide liquidity and finance for activities. And so I'm sure he wouldn't make a blanket statement that hedge funds are bad or anything like that. I think as a person who's been chairman of the Commerce Committee, he also recognizes the importance of having nimble regulators who are keeping an eye on the innovation. And I think I would expect that he would take an active role in making sure that regulations evolved with financial markets, so that the two didn't get out of line in a way that would create the kind of crisis we've had in the mortgage sector this time.
Brian, any comment on that?
Just very, very briefly. I mean, I think just similarly, I don't think Senator Flynn would look at the question as good, bad, or otherwise, but do we have the right regulatory framework to encourage growth and innovation while at the same time effectively managing risk? And again, as a senator from New York, she's both very familiar with and also in tune with the importance of having a regulatory framework that works, and believes very strongly that you do need effective regulation to ensure that you can actually maintain financial innovation that is good for the economy. I think that her view is that we have veered away from effective regulation in the current environment, and has outlined a number of specific steps that she thinks needs to be taken, but in broad strokes are not dissimilar from what Dan was talking about.
Question back here?
Hi, I'm Jo Marie Grace-Crowder with New Rules for Global Finance, and I'm curious how the candidates situate the United States in our financial turbulence in the global context, and how you would work with global partners to bring about the stability that's needed for U.S. domestic growth, and specifically, does the IMF have any role in that?
Kevin, you want to try that?
Yeah, I think that there are times when the IMF serves an important role. I think the current international crisis is not one that's traditionally been the role of the IMF to intercede in the sense that it's the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve have been as active as anybody else. I think that it's very important at times like this to keep an eye on the actions of our neighbors. But again, to the extent that there's a banking problem or banking crisis that's spreading, then it's the roles of the central banks to cooperate and address those questions. I think that that's something that's been managed reasonably well, very effectively at times at least, and given the very, very serious stresses that the economies have been under. I expect, again, that Senator McCain, I've seen him discuss these issues, and he respects the independence of these organizations and is grateful that they've worked so effectively together.
Brian, you know?
I think Senator Clinton certainly thinks that the IMF has a role to play. One example, back in November, she called on the IMF to be more proactive about outlining a set of transparency guidelines for sovereign wealth funds, an area where we currently don't have the kind of basic transparency to know what sovereign wealth funds are investing in and how they are constituted. And Senator Clinton certainly thinks that having increased transparency would be valuable, and that the IMF has an important role to play there. The IMF has since actually moved forward with that process, and so that's something that she's certainly heartened by. And more generally, in the context of addressing the regulatory failures that have really driven the current crisis, it's certainly vital when at the point at which we undertake the type of broader regulatory reform. In addition, when whether we look at capital requirements or increased transparency, that we do it with an eye on coordinating internationally, so that we don't put our own businesses and our own financial industry at a competitive disadvantage. I think that likewise, a lot of that is something that can be done in coordination with countries informally, or not necessarily within the context of
So, Joe Marie, I think you know better than probably anybody in the room that the roles and function of the IMF have changed several times in its existence. And just about everybody who looks at it, I think including the people within the IMF, believe that it's in the midst of another such transformation. And where it's going is obviously going to depend in part, and I hope in significant part, on how the next president tries to reshape international economic structures in order to promote U.S. interests, but promote global stability and global economic growth. A couple more specifics. One, and let me just say, we don't have an articulated plan for the IMF. Okay, so we don't have a little position paper on the website that you can go and download, unlike a lot of other things. So I'm bringing in some of the policies that we do have that are relevant to the IMF. One I've already mentioned, which is currency. We can't have the fastest growing large economy in the world running massive current account surpluses and having a highly undervalued currency. That's something that needs to change. The IMF to date hasn't been able to push us along the road to those changes. With respect to financial regulation as such, I think there we're probably not principally focused, or we shouldn't be principally focused on the fund either as the source of the problem, and probably not as a principal solution to the problem. I think we can look for the source of the problem right here in the United States, with the failure of our government to provide the kind of financial regulatory structure that was necessary to respond to changes in financial markets. When we redid our banking laws 10 years ago, 9 years ago, we didn't really do anything to address what had changed and what was changing in those markets. we need to take those steps as Senator Obama has suggested. And one of the things that he specifically suggested was this needs to be coordinated with the other regulators in other major financial countries. And that's why the Basel Committee, or IOSCO, is probably in the first instance where you want to go to coordinate this kind of financial regulatory activity.
Question? One more. No?
Our panelists actually have to go.
I have to be somewhere at 12:30.
Okay, I'm sorry. Did you want to make closing remarks?
I'll just thank folks. Rudy, thank you, and thank you to all of our panelists. We know you have such busy schedules, and we had 4 great panels today. I know I learned a lot from each panel, so I hope it was as interesting to everybody else. Undoubtedly, as the election and campaign continues, all the sponsoring organizations will have more policy events. So thank you today, and of course there is dancing in the ballroom.